Hello and welcome back. Welcome back to Amplify the Signal. Next up, we have the Aarons. Aaron Welsh and Aaron Allman Updike are the creators of This Podcast Will Kill You. They'll tell you they found themselves a little disenchanted at the insularity of academia, those conferences where we only understand what we said and nobody else. They wanted to share a love of epidemics and weird medical mysteries with the world, not just colleagues. So they created a show. Their podcast explores public health and dives into the history and biology and current status of infectious diseases. Each episode even features the recipe for a cocktail, a quarantini. Aaron Welsh graduated in 2018 with a PhD in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology from the University of Illinois. Her dissertation focused on potential effects of climate change on tick-borne disease risk in Panama. She is currently a postdoctoral researcher in Finland, and she has just flown in to be with us. Erin Allman Updike completed her PhD in entomology here at the University of Illinois in 2018. She studied the ecology and epidemiology of Chagas disease in Panama, and she is currently working toward her MD degree. Please welcome Dr. Aaron Welsh and Dr. Erin Allman Updike.
Hello. I'm Erin Welsh.
And I'm Erin Allman Updike.
Thank you so much today for being here. And we also want to give a huge thank you to Diana and everyone else for putting this amazing workshop together. It's been really wonderful so far, and we're excited to see the rest of the day.
We're thrilled to be talking to you guys today.
Yes. So before we get started, we want to give you a little bit of a background, a little bit of taste about the podcast, because hopefully everyone knows what a podcast is.
Right? Yeah?
I don't know. I mean, maybe it's possible that you don't. But maybe you don't know what our podcast is.
Right.
And so I don't know how many of you have listened to it, or if anyone has. Okay. Oh, nice hands there. That's good.
More than we expected.
Yes, for sure. But what we have put together for you is a little bit of a clip, because show, not tell.
Right. So we're going to stand here awkwardly while you hear tape of us talking.
Yes. Warning, for the squeamish, this is about to get graphic.
Inside Tony Love's fingers, they found pockets of pus the size of nickels. There was one in the center of his hand. It was the size of a golf ball. His left knee, the one he couldn't bend, was rigid and swollen.
Hi there.
Hi,
I'm Erin Welsh,
and I'm Erin Updike.
and we're the hosts of This Podcast Will Kill You, a podcast that explores diseases and their effects on the world.
Each episode, we dive into a new disease. We cover its biology and explain exactly how it makes you sick. So, you start with a fever, but then within 2 to 3 days, you're not getting better. And at the back of your throat, you'll see this thing. And it starts out white, just sort of attached to like the roof of your mouth and like back near your tonsils. And then it gets bigger.
I don't like this.
It just keeps getting bigger. And it starts out white, but as it grows to cover your entire soft palate, it can turn green.
Oh my
Or gray or black.
God, black?
Yeah. And it's not really pus, because pus, you can kind of spit that out, right? Like mucus. You could sort of put your finger back there and scrape it off.
Oh, ugh.
You can't do that with this because it's stuck on. And if you try, like if you really, really try in there, you're just going to cause yourself to bleed a lot because it's stuck on there.
Then we trace its history over time, from its origins to its impacts on society.
So, if those cures seem a little crazy to you,
Yeah.
hold on to your butts.
Oh, clenching.
You can also administer the ashes of the tail of a shrew mouse, but only if the shrew mouse survived the tail removal and then was set free. It's the only way it's going to work.
How do you administer? How do you administer the tail of a shrew mouse?
So, here's my favorite, though.
Okay.
The old skin of a snake that has been cast in spring. I don't know what that means. Beaten up, wait, with a male crab in wine.
Finally, we discuss the status of the disease in the world today.
And we do it all with a stiff drink by our side.
It's quarantine time.
So,
Okay. Aren't you glad you ate
presentation
lunch
over.
before? Yeah.
so that was just a little intro for those of you who have never heard the podcast. Those were some clips from episodes from this season. So the very first part that you heard was from our MRSA episode. And that's every episode we start with a firsthand account. And we do that to kind of humanize the disease and to make you understand what it's really like for someone to actually live through it.
Right. And then we dive into the biology, so really give you the information, the nitty-gritty of what this pathogen does. And after that, we go into the history, because it's really important to have this personality, this character of a pathogen that you can then hear about how it has impacted humanity.
Right. So the clips that you heard were from our diphtheria episode and then also from the rabies episode, which were old Roman cures.
Old Roman cures.
Naturally.
Yeah.
They didn't work, by the way, to cure rabies.
They did not work, so yeah, spoilers. Nothing works on rabies anyway.
So for this session, we wanted to really keep it interactive. And so we're kind of going to do a big Q&A. And before we open it up to questions from you guys, because we want to know like what you want to know from us, even though we're total noobs to the whole science communication thing, So we'll give you a little bit of intro on how we got started, why we started the podcast, what our sort of inspiration was, and then we'll open it up to questions. So we're going to leave a ton of time for questions at the end. So start thinking
Start thinking
what
now.
you want to ask.
Okay. Okay. But we always have to begin at the beginning.
Right.
And who doesn't love an origin story?
They're the best.
Right. So, how did this podcast get started? It started because we were being incredibly antisocial at a barbecue, which is what typically we do when we're together. We just hang out with each other and ignore everyone else. And it's not a good trait, and it's not a cute trait. But in this case, it happened to work. Because what we were doing is we were off to the side at this barbecue, and we got started on the conversation about podcasts, what podcasts we've been listening to, what we liked about them, and really enjoying the sound of our own voices.
Just a hint of narcissism that
Just
day.
a hint, yeah. And I said, we should start a podcast.
And I was like, this is a great idea. We
And
should
I said-
absolutely start a
No,
podcast.
I was joking, but it was too late. Like, seed had been planted, and that was it. And
Yeah.
so we thought, okay, well, what would we even talk about?
Right.
Well, obviously disease. We both love disease. We've bonded over it. We talk about disease all the time anyway. Why not record ourselves doing it?
So that's sort of how we started. And then kind of actually one of the very first things that we came up with that made it seem like, man, maybe this is actually an idea that could work was our quarantini.
Yes.
So
So here are a couple examples of quarantinis. So we create a cocktail for each episode of the podcast, each disease. And so on the left here, you have a rash decision, which was made for measles.
naturally.
And chronically wasted, which was made for prions, so to honor chronic wasting disease.
Pretty good.
And as you see, for each of these, we create an alcoholic version if you partake and a non-alcoholic placebo-rita if you don't. So, yeah. So once that happened, and because once the pun door opened, we were
Right.
like, okay, well, now we have to do something with this. What's next? Well, we need a name.
Yeah. So we're like, if we actually made a podcast and we talked about disease and we drank quarantinis, what would we call it?
This podcast will kill you.
Which I was like, as soon as I heard that, I was like, well, you can't stop me now. We're making this podcast.
Yeah, it was too late. The
Even
train
though
had-
it was really just this idea that we were like, oh, ha, 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 we should make a podcast. And then it was like, we have a quarantini, we have a name, let's do this.
Yeah. So then we had to decide three crucial things. What was left to decide was the scope of the podcast,
Right.
the structure of the podcast, because we could talk about this and we could record ourselves, but who's going to want to actually listen to that? It would be a
Nobody.
nightmare.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even want to listen to that. And actually, I hate the sound of my own voice anyway after all this editing and podcasting. And then we had to decide who our audience was. Who were we actually trying to tell these stories to? So when we started, we thought, okay, what's the scope? Infectious diseases. That's all right.
Right.
But we didn't want to cage ourselves in too much, so maybe diseases, that's a little broad. So we had to define the edges of this. And we thought, okay, well, we're in a final year of our grad school.
Yeah, this was we were supposed to be in our second to last semester of
Yes.
grad school
Yeah.
at this time.
Great
which is
time to start
excellent
a
time.
time-intensive project.
Yeah,
And
no problems whatsoever.
so we wanted to have an end cap. We wanted to have some sort of structure and say, okay, well, what is for this season, we wanted to do a season, what is the scope that we're going to cover? We thought, let's start big. Let's start with the big diseases, the ones that people have heard of, the ones that maybe you've seen a documentary about on PBS and thought, oh, that's great. I would like to learn more about that. So we did things like on polio, plague, the influenza, smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, a few other ones in there. And we thought, okay, this will be a way to test out the idea, test out the podcast, and also see, does this work?
Right.
And also to maybe hook people, because if we can get people interested in these big name ones, maybe we can slide in a few more unknown ones in there.
Exactly. And so now that we knew what the scope of our podcast was going to be, and that for the first season at least we were going to focus on these big name diseases and then hopefully make our way to sort of lesser known ones later, the question became, what is the structure of this podcast actually going to be? And for that, we really had to think about what is it about podcasts that we enjoy, and what is it about learning about infectious diseases that we enjoy? What are the stories that we like to listen to, and why do we like to listen to those? And so we were very intentional in thinking about how are we going to structure this podcast in a way that tells a story? Because like Ed Yong said yesterday, nobody has to listen to this. Right? And there are millions of podcasts out there. So why would anybody want to listen to us talking about infectious disease over some other podcast?
Right. And so we thought, okay, what are the things that we have really liked? And one of the things was for podcasts, was this conversational learning style. I mean, we all love to listen to podcasts, or at least most of us do, I think. I mean, it really helps along days in the lab, and it's great to be able to learn at the same time. And so what we really liked were these conversational ones where one person was telling the other person new information. And you could be a part of that learning experience, part of that conversation, sort of like sitting in a room with friends that are not there, you know?
They can't hear you, but you can hear them,
yeah.
like that.
So we thought, okay, that's a great way to start. And then we thought, okay, well, what are the other aspects of disease that we want to cover? And I have always loved the history. I've always loved reading about the historical impacts of disease on society, on humanity, on laws, and sort of tracing back both the researchers who have uncovered these pathogens and the way that a particular epidemic has destroyed a population, and seeing what are the aftermath of that. And so we've taken a lot of classes throughout our lives. We've taken ones on biology, we've taken ones on history, on political science, on microbiology. And let's say that you learn about the plague in each of those classes. In each of those subjects, you're going to learn about it in a very different way and through a very different lens. Mm-hmm. If you learn about the plague in history, you might learn that 40 to 60% of Europe's population was killed in the great pandemic of the 14th century. You may learn that laws were created and that the English language became the predominant one, all of these different facets. And then in microbiology, you might learn that the bacterium plugs up the flea's stomach so then it vomits bacteria on you. It's very cool, but you may not learn about those things together. You learn about them in isolation.
Right.
And while that's very interesting, I think it has much more of an impact when you can see this as a whole. You can place the biology in the context of the history, and you can place the history in the context of biology.
Right.
So we wanted to sort of create this structure where we give you the information about the bacterium, about the virus, and then we can say, now here's the story of how it has affected humanity.
Yeah.
And then
we bring it all back to the present day. So does the plague still exist? Should we be afraid of it? Do I need to be losing sleep over it? So we wrap up each episode with the epidemiology and the current status, and also the current research. What's going on? How are we studying this disease today? And so that's how we decided on the structure of our podcast. And then, as all good group projects go, you have to divide up the workload, which is really fun.
Right.
So we very quickly realized that dividing it equally down the middle, or like swapping back and forth, I'll do the history this week and then you do it next week, was absolutely not going to work. No. Because we have very specific passions. We have things that we are really interested in learning about. I love to find the specific mechanism of how did this bacteria, how did it get here, and how does it get into your body, and what does it do inside of your body, and then how does that, what it's doing, actually result in the symptoms that you see? Why are you coughing up blood? What's that bacteria doing to you?
I love hearing about that, but I don't want to put in the effort to read about it. I would much rather read a historical textbook or a pop sci book, something like that, that tells me the overview, and I can get this huge scope of the problem.
Right.
So it really comes down to just sort of what are our strengths, and listening to that, listening to what are the things that we actually enjoy about learning, and then letting that sort of guide the rest of the podcast.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So then we knew what the scope of this first season was going to look like. We knew what the structure of each episode was going to be. And as researchers, we knew that we are not experts on these topics. So we were going to have to find ways to convince people that we knew what we were talking about, even though we're not experts on this. And so we rely really heavily on literature.
Yes.
So we do a ton of research for each episode, and then we cite all of our sources, because that's what we've been trained to do.
Yes. So we cite them both within each episode at the end. We say these are the books that we've read, these are the articles that we've read, and then we guide people to our website where we have listed for each episode all of the different papers that we have used. And we also have made a Goodreads list where listeners can contribute to and vote for different books and anything that they want, really.
Which also means that if people find something super interesting in the podcast, they know where they can go to find even more information. And then from there, they can dig even deeper, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
So we basically had the overall structure of this podcast, but what we needed to really be able to define was who did we want to listen to it?
Right.
Who did we want our audience to be? And I think that's something that's really important in any kind of communication in general, is knowing who you're talking to, because that defines the tone of whatever media it is that you're creating, and it also defines how much detail you need to go into. What kind of jargon are you using versus avoiding?
Yeah.
And we were very intentional about deciding who we wanted this podcast to be for. And we decided that we wanted it to be for non-science people.
Yeah. Yeah, as Jennifer mentioned, it's no coincidence that this podcast idea sort of came about in our final year of grad school after 5 years, 6 years of just, grueling writing papers and grants where all the creativity, for the most part, can be cut away, because that's just, you have to trim the fat to get the word count down. And we had also had an intense summer of academic conferences which are really interesting and valuable and fun and hugely important, but we found ourselves, no shade, we found ourselves in these rooms thinking the research that's being discussed in this room is not going to leave this room for the most part. It's going to be, it's talked about in this language that is largely inaccessible to the greater population. And particularly in a field like disease ecology, we just felt that was very frustrating for us. We wanted to be able for our family members, for our cousins, for our friends who are outside academia to be able to understand and read this information in a way that was not difficult, whether you didn't have to have a graduate degree in biology.
Right. Yeah, and so we made that very sort of specific in how we decided to go about doing this podcast, in that we wanted it to be accessible for everybody. So at this point, we pretty much knew what we were doing, and then the question just became, how the heck do you make a podcast? Which it turns out is extremely easy to do.
You just Google it.
We Googled it.
You Google it. It's really easy.
That's why every dude in his mom's basement has a podcast.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah. Like when we tell people oh yeah, we have a podcast, they're like, oh yeah, so yeah, so does everyone.
Yeah.
It's cool.
It is very easy to do.
So easy. And so that's essentially what we did is, there's research to be done on what kind of microphone do you use or this and that, but all of that information is available online and it's super accessible. So then the real hurdle for us was learning not only how to edit, but choosing how we edit. Because although we do keep this podcast very conversational, we are aware, first of all, that no one wants to hear us burping and belching. Like happens sometimes when you're sitting for 2 hours talking about gross things.
Yeah.
But we also wanted to make sure that we weren't coming across as experts when in fact we are not.
Right.
So in editing, we make very strategic decisions about, a lot of times because the conversation that we're having is an organic conversation, and I don't know what Erin has researched for the history beforehand. She doesn't know what parts of the biology I'm going to be talking about. So questions will come up between us, like, well, how does that work? How does that actual part of that bacterial life cycle work? And I'll have to say, well, I don't know. I didn't look that up.
Yeah.
And we'll leave those parts in because we feel like that's important to get across that, first of all, we don't know everything, but also nobody knows everything.
Right.
And what's great is that it means that people who do know who listen can write to us and let us know, and then we can learn and we can share that information going forward.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And so now we had a complete podcast, right?
Done.
No. Because we still had to get it out to people. How do we actually have this product and have people listen to it?
Right.
And that's where
there's millions of podcasts out there, and so you can't hear it if you don't know that it exists. And so figuring out how to get our name out there and to kind of annoyingly get in people's faces a little bit so they knew that we existed was one of our first real challenges.
And that's where social media really came into play.
Yeah.
And for better or for worse, social media is a huge thing, and it can be a really wonderful, valuable tool. And so what we did was we created a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, and we did a lot of self-promotion, which doesn't feel that great, but is really important to do. And it was actually a really amazing way to make connections with people and to get our name out there, and it happened to really work at times.
Yeah. And then what was very cool about using social media in this way, since we didn't know any other way really to get our names out there, we didn't know how to do PR things. We just knew we use social media and we hear about things on social media. So that's where we did our big push when we first started this, was just Twitter and Facebook and all these things. And what that actually was able to turn into was a whole nother way to connect to people beyond just this audio platform that a podcast actually is.
So one of my favorite things to do is, and I would be doing it regardless of whether the podcast existed or not, is look up old pictures of posters, like public health posters, or beautiful illustrations of bacteria, viruses, and so on. Like you see here, there's a beautiful electron, I think, micrograph of gonorrhea. You see some Zika there, a plague poster, and then just a general poster. And we do this, we post these as a way to add a visual component, to add another layer to this information that we're presenting. And it's also a really amazing way to get people to engage. You can ask questions. What's your favorite disease movie? What's better, Contagion or Outbreak? And
obviously Contagion, by the way. There's no.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
But I mean, Outbreak does. Okay, it's fine. We can talk about it later. And then there's also a way we were able to use it to say, okay, how do we maintain consistent engagement? Because we changed, our first season was every single week, and that was
a lot. Yeah.
So then we switched to every other week because we also have full-time jobs outside of podcasting. And we thought, okay, well, people have short attention spans because there's so much information that's being blasted at you. So how do you keep a presence in people's minds? You have to maintain engagement. And so we created things like Skeleton Saturday to say, okay, every Saturday, remember us, we're here, we're posting a picture of a skeleton that's an old anatomical drawing or a memento mori or something to that effect. And we also have our Quarantini and Placiborita hashtags, which can make it easy to find us and sort of link through all of our different graphics that we present.
Right. It's a way for when we get new listeners, they can maybe click on that one single hashtag and find every Quarantini that we've ever made, which is awesome because then
because then drink recipes for days.
Right. Yeah. And beyond all of that, I think one of the biggest benefits that we've had to social media is that it's an amazing way to connect with people in real time. As soon as an episode drops, we are immediately getting feedback while literally we're still asleep because the episode comes out in the middle of the night. And people are already listening to it, and then they're tweeting at us and they're writing to us and they're saying awesome things like, hey, this was really fun and this was my favorite part of the episode, so we can learn what kinds of things worked. And then they're also letting us know when we get things wrong, like, hey, you left out this entire chunk, or hey, you said this, but it's actually more like this. And then we can learn from those things and we can improve them moving forward.
Right. Yeah, and so this has been a really amazing way to sort of see we are doing some things right, but we also don't get things right all the time.
Yeah.
And so we have to remember that as we tell any story, as any person tells any story, you have in it your own personal biases, you have your own experiences, you have your own background. And so that has been a very important thing to remember. So that we didn't ever expect that our podcast would be listened to more than like 10 people.
Yeah.
Ever.
Well, I think we're like 25.
Okay, 25,
I
yeah.
hoped.
At the extreme end.
Yeah.
And so then as it kind of has gained more listeners, we thought, okay, became more and more the realization that this is a huge gift and a huge responsibility because we are not experts and we don't portray ourselves as experts, but that doesn't change the fact that some people do look to us for information, for factual information, because we have this amazing privilege of having this voice that people, for some reason, want to listen to.
Right.
And so, we don't try to make this a neutral information podcast. That was a trade-off that we decided early on. Public health and politics are intricately intertwined, and I have no interest in saying, oh, well, let's just ignore the fact that these health disparities exist because of politics. I think that it's really important to include that facet because in reading about all of these diseases, I feel like we have a moral obligation to show that the dark side of humanity really has made an impact in terms of disease. And so, so we have this responsibility to acknowledge our biases, and that has been an ongoing thing that we're working on. So when we listen back to early episodes, which we don't like to do, and just as when you read back, or you read a paper that you have written 5 years ago, or a grant proposal, and you're like, I cannot believe I used that sentence structure, what was I thinking, this vocabulary, oh my gosh, and you cringe, I think that's a really good sign because it shows that you have grown in that time. You have grown to recognize the things that haven't worked, or the things that maybe that haven't been done artfully in the past. And we are constantly learning. And I think that that's one of the best things that social media has allowed us to happen, is that we have this immediate feedback of people questioning us and saying, hey, why didn't you talk about this? And we have to examine, well, why didn't we talk about that? Is it because we didn't know about it, or is it because we thought it was unimportant? And if we did, why did we think it was unimportant?
Right. Yeah. And so overall, I think even though we're very new to this whole, like, we're science communicators, I guess. That's like, it's weird
I guess
to even,
technically,
that is what we are doing. And it's awesome and it's really fun, but we're very new at it. And I think that we've learned a ton as we've sort of done this over the past year and a half to almost 2 years now.
Yeah.
And I think some of the biggest takeaways that we have had is just first knowing who that audience is, knowing who it is that you're trying to connect to. And sometimes that does mean making trade-offs. Like, there are people who are never going to listen to our podcast because of choices that we've made on it. And that's a trade-off, you know? But knowing who that audience is that you are trying to get to and making sure that you're making choices to target that audience, I think is really important.
And then knowing the scope, so
Yeah.
outlining what it is that you want to talk about and what you feel comfortable talking about as well, because there are things that, you know, we're not experts, but we're also way less experts in some areas than others.
Yeah.
And finally, the structure. So having some sort of consistent narrative structure, I think, is really important in getting that message across and in making it interesting and memorable.
Yeah.
And finally, being open-minded to feedback.
Which is hard to do, especially when it comes so rapidly and sometimes really not nicely. But a lot of times there is still constructive feedback in it, and you can ignore the pieces that are not constructive and take the ones that are.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's been pretty much our experience so far. So with that, we just kind of want to open it up to tons of questions, whatever you guys would like to know. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you mind sharing what your viewership is right now, or listening audience is?
Oh, sorry, just so it actually.
Do you guys mind sharing what your viewership is or listenership is right now, and then what your plans are for the future? If you have any long-term plans with this?
Sure.
Yeah. Do you mean like our numbers of things or demographics? Unfortunately, I don't know the demographics of. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I was gonna say I know that information exists, but I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know
think
it either.
after about, within a two-week or month window, we get roughly 220,000 downloads per episode.
Which is a lot more than we ever. I mean, when we started.
I don't know who these people are. Like,
That's,
who wants
we
to
ask
know?
ourselves that often.
Yeah.
We're like, who is listening to this and why?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little over 200,000, and it was a very slow growth at first. We were stoked the first time we got to 1,000 downloads. We were like, this is amazing!
Yeah.
1,000 humans! I don't know 1,000 humans.
No.
So it was very cool. And then because of social media and connections that we made over social media, we ended up joining the Exactly Right Network, which we're now a part of. And that was really a big thing that boosted our listenership even further. Yeah. It's been growing ever since. And in terms of future plans, we have so much fun making this podcast that we just want to keep doing it.
We have so many fun ideas too, if we just had more time. So I think that one of the things that we really want to start doing, and we have started to do more, is incorporate interviews from experts. So our episode, which was released yesterday, is the first part of a two-part series on vaccines, which has been, a lot of people have asked for vaccines in this day and age when there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy.
A lot of
and
misinformation and disinformation.
As we learned yesterday. Yep. And so for this first interview, for this first podcast episode, we interviewed a couple of people from the Gates Foundation to say, okay, what is it like to actually administer these vaccines in a global setting? What are the challenges that you face? And then also, what is next on the vaccine front? Like, what do you see as the future of vaccines? What are the things that you see as challenges as well? So, yeah, these are the big things.
I love your podcast, by the way. It's been a recent discovery of mine, and I highly recommend it. My question is about how do you balance these things? So finishing up your PhDs, now you're doing your postdocs, and doing this amazing podcast. I can't conceive of how you're actually able to do it.
It's a lot of time. I mean, it is like, we've gotten it down more or less to a science at this point.
I was gonna say we don't do anything else for fun.
No. This is it.
Out the window.
We often say, what would we do with ourselves if we didn't do this podcast?
I would watch so much more Netflix.
Oh
is
my
the
God.
thing.
Yeah,
Like,
it would be amazing.
yeah.
I would actually go outside every once in a while. No.
Yeah, that's true too.
But so we do have, it is very challenging, and particularly during our PhDs, it was sort of a lot of really late nights, but it becomes a habit after a certain point, and you kind of just, you fit it into your lives. And so I do readings every single night after I get back from work, and I take notes, and then it becomes an efficiency thing. So the editing at the beginning, just technically speaking, took a really long time. And now that we know more of what we want to cover on each episode, and we have sort of a rhythm down, it's just, most of the editing is sort of just piecing it together, and the mixing and producing, and making some of those choices as we mentioned. But it's just habit. It becomes a little bit faster. And we also have sort of like backlogs of pictures, and we're doing this less on the fly, and having those 2 weeks of well, not downtime.
Yeah, well,
2 weeks of like in between.
Switching to bi-weekly was a big help, and that was one thing
Yes.
we knew we were going to have to do when we started season 2, because by the end of season 1, we were like scrambling at.
Oh, it was like lots of 3 in the morning, like
Yeah.
editing, and oh my gosh,
Oh,
yeah.
that was Ebola.
That was the
terrible.
worst, yeah.
But I think too, like we have periods where we manage to balance things better, and then we have periods where we feel like we're failing.
Yeah.
And what's nice is that because there's 2 of us, usually we feel like we're failing at different times, so then the other person can help pick up the slack.
Yeah, we
So
do
far,
have this
knock on
very
wood.
interesting balance. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's worked out so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was just wondering if there is a topic you won't touch.
Ooh.
I saw a book, the reason why I asked, I saw a book that's about Lyme disease and saying, is it a failed bioweapon? And I'm like, what? No.
We are planning an episode on Lyme disease. That's going to be a hefty, there's
Yeah.
a lot to unpack with Lyme disease. So that there are topics I think that seem a lot more daunting to us. Actually, vaccines was one that we had been wanting to do for a really long time, and we ended up deciding to do it as 2 parts because we realized there was no way we could cram it all into one episode. I don't think that we've come across any things yet that we wouldn't ever consider. I think, yeah, in general, it's kind of just figuring out how to cover a topic and like what kind of help we're going to need, who we're going to want to interview, because there are some things that like the interviews that we got from the Gates Foundation, we would have been able to have that information otherwise because we don't have that experience, and it's not things that you can just read in a paper. And so I think being able to identify those for topics that are really far outside of our area of expertise. But we are trying to sort of expand beyond we've expanded beyond infectious disease. We've done episodes on scurvy, and we've done a lot of crossover episodes on things like plants, and we have some fungal things planned.
Yeah, we do.
It's going to be really fun. So yeah, I don't think there's anything.
I think the only thing that it would just be getting experts. So one of the things that I can think of that we've had a conversation about that we want to eventually cover is addiction or some form of addiction. And we don't have the background, even the language to be able to talk about that in a knowledgeable or in a nice way. And so we want to say, okay, we want to have people who can tell us and can talk us through that, or we can interview them and say, how do we talk about this?
Yeah.
What is the background?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I had a question about your research. When you're trying to research a topic for a podcast, when you decide to draw a line and say, okay, we've had enough material that is, enough for us to talk about the topic and be confident that okay, this will suffice. So when do you make that choice, or when do you make that call?
It's a good question.
I think we both do overkill a lot.
I think you do more overkill than I do.
I feel very, I feel unqualified all the time. I think it's just imposter syndrome throughout the rest of my life. And so as a result, I try to get as much information as possible. And what I'm doing while I'm reading these books, while I'm reading these articles, is I'm sort of going down a rabbit hole. So if I see an interesting phrase or something like that, and I want to either fact check it, or I want to say, well, I want to read more about that, then I go and I find another paper, and that usually leads me to another place. And so at the end of the day, when I feel like I've had enough information is if I feel like I can tell a story, and I feel like if you asked me a question about something, part of that story, that I would be able to at least think about where I would look for that answer if I don't have it immediately in my head. But I don't know what your process is.
I think for me, it was more challenging at the beginning, and it's gotten easier as we've further defined our sort of structure. So especially, this is another, like, we play to our strengths. I think it's way easier to research the biology than the history, because the history is like everything about this pathogen. And it really is much more broad, whereas with the biology, there's certain things that I know that I need to cover. I know I need to cover how is this transmitted. I need to cover what is the pathogenesis of this. I need to, there are certain topics that I know I need to hit on. So I'll first try and find those things. I've got my little outline of these are the specific points I want to hit. And then if there are certain things about this pathogen that are particularly interesting, then I want to make sure that I include those as well. So yeah, I think we have very different approaches to it, and I think that's part of just because that's the biology and the history and the epidemiology are very different inherently. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Hi. So you talk a little bit about your own political views in the podcast, and I really like it because I feel like it makes you more human, and it shows that you're passionate about things other than just science. And but I wonder, I know there have been instances where faculty members have been reprimanded for expressing their views kind of on social media. And I was wondering if you've had any pushback from the institutions you work for or are at a student with or are a student at, or if that's, how do you manage that, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't so
We haven't
far.
Yeah.
Maybe people just haven't noticed us yet.
Yeah, maybe.
Like next week we're gonna get a cease and desist letter.
I feel like much of Finland is in agreement with it.
Yeah, that's
with
true.
our political views, but yeah.
Yeah,
we'll
no,
see.
so far we haven't had anything like that.
Yeah.
We definitely get pushback from people, like listening. We get plenty of angry emails that are like, stop talking about politics.
Yeah.
But we really did make that decision early on that it's something that we don't feel like we can ignore. And so, yeah, it's our personal opinions about things. But it's also, we try and have opinions from the historical context that we're talking about, I guess.
And I think that over time, I at least have tried to be more careful in the language that I use. And instead of just expressing like disgust or hatred towards a person for their decisions, it's more of like, okay, well, how can we be better? What are the things that we can actually learn from this? Why do we look at this now and say, that's a horrible thing? What are the ethics of this?
Right.
And it's like, okay, well, let's consider the historical context and how we have learned from that. And so I have been trying to be better about that language in that way.
That was something we tried really hard with our 2 vaccines episodes, is because vaccines is such a topic right now, and there's so many people on both sides that get just very, very angry.
Yeah.
And so we tried really hard to avoid any of that anger.
And the creation of we didn't want to contribute to the echo chamber in that way.
So we kind of just tried in that way to just present the information as it is, as much as we could.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So far, so good. Yeah.
Is there any particular type of impact that you've had that you are most proud of, whether it's on a person or societally or whatever it might be? I'm just curious about that because you got 220,000 downloads. You're obviously impacting people, but is there something you can point to with some element of pride that really helped, do something?
What's yours?
I think I have a few. I really like the people who say, I got my flu shot for the first time because
that's my
of that.
favorite.
Yeah.
We've had so
That's
many
huge.
people. I mean, because we both have public health backgrounds. We did our master's in epidemiology, and you in public health, like a lot of the conversation is like, how do we get people on a population level to care about these things? How do we get people to get their dang flu shots? And so when someone writes us and is like, I got my flu shot for the first time because of your podcast, I just want to lay down and be like, it's done. I'm done. That's it. I can never do better.
Yeah. No, it is. That's a really good feeling. And I think the other one that we get, and it's still every single time I get it, is the best feeling. Every time we get this email, and it'll say, I never thought I liked science. I always thought I was bad at science. People told me you shouldn't do science because you're not good at it. And then I listened to your podcast, and I like it and I understand it.
Yeah.
And that makes me feel really happy because those are the people that we want to reach. And those are the people where it's not that you're not good at science or you don't like science. It's that maybe you you're not taught in a way that is worked
you.
for you. And so those are my other favorite.
Yeah.
impacts.
And or people who, we've had a lot of people who have decided to go into public health or epidemiology or a more like medical field because of listening to the podcast, where they're like, I didn't know I was so into disease, but it's my favorite thing, which is how both of us got into disease too, was people who were really passionate and excited about it and taught classes, and we were like, this is the best thing ever. So it's really thrilling to be able to like feel like we're passing that on to people that we've never even met. It's incredible.
It feels very surreal. I'm like, did you send this email to the right people?
Yeah.
Two kind of process questions. First, how do you go about sourcing your firsthand accounts? And second, how has your process and dynamic changed when you're not both in the same location physically?
Okay. So for the firsthand accounts, sometimes I just get lucky. So sometimes it'll be a book that I'm reading that has a really good description in there. Other times it'll be a quote that I just look for online, sort of like a diary or a journal or something like that. I really need to build those tools and how to find firsthand accounts, because I struggle with it occasionally if it's not readily in the book or the literature that I'm reading. But in general, yeah. And then we also have tried in the past to get firsthand accounts from people who actually have had whatever disease that we're talking about. And I think we're going to try to transition to doing that a lot more, because I think that tends to have more of an impact, or at least I would feel like it has more of an impact coming from the mouth of the person who actually has experience with this.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
And the other question was about how our dynamic has changed.
Yes.
Surprisingly little, actually. I think the hardest part is the time difference.
Yeah.
So Erin's in Finland and I'm still here, and so it's an 8
hours.
8 hour time difference.
Yeah.
So it definitely has been a challenge just in terms of the timing of things and how we communicate is like we do a lot more emailing now. And also it kind of sucks because I don't know if you can tell, but we were kind of friends. We kind of like each other.
Yeah.
And so now it's like almost all of the time that we ever get to interact is like business podcast things. So that's kind of sometimes a challenge where we have to be like, can we set aside an hour to just talk about fun stuff?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think overall, like we managed to find a way to where when we sit down to actually record, it feels like we're still in the same room. So that part of the dynamic, I don't think has changed a ton.
No, I haven't. I don't think it has changed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mostly just logistics.
Logistics, yeah.
Yeah, this kind of touches back on one of the other questions a second ago, but how do you handle like the idea of imposter syndrome, or like maybe a future employer like hearing this or judging you for something that maybe 2 years ago you didn't know or understand very well, and then kind of coming from a murderino's perspective, how do you handle scary or, publicity that maybe you don't want, like in a digital age where somebody could Google you really fast,
Yeah.
That's something that scared me and kind of held me back from wanting to get more onto social media platforms.
Oh, it is creepy, man. Especially because we still have all of our like university emails, and people have mailed us stuff to here, and we're like, how did you do that?
I'm like, I don't live here anymore.
It's so easy to
Which
find
is nice,
us.
actually.
Yeah. That part has been a little bit weird.
Yeah, and I think it's just sort of this, it's a trade-off, right? Like, that with every episode that we put out, anything that we put online is there forever. The internet doesn't forget.
Yeah.
So that is daunting and that is scary. And so what we try to do is whenever we do have a correction or whenever we feel like we have said something wrong, we try to include that in a later episode or change our language. And yeah, as far as future employers are concerned, it is a challenge. It is to say, well, especially because if we want to keep doing this for as long as we possibly can. And so if taking on a job that would say, well, you can, we would hire you, but you can't do this, or you can't talk about this.
Yeah.
I don't think I would want to do that.
I think we've become so attached to it now that we've kind of been like, if you don't like our podcast, I don't know, that's silly.
Well, you guys are doing a great job at it, so keep going.
It definitely is something that, so I'm doing my MD PhD, so I'm still in medical school here, and I think a lot about, is this podcast going to help or hurt me when I go to do residency applications? And I have no idea what the answer to that is, and I won't know until I apply. I think that, we do get things wrong, and then we try and correct them. And I think that overall, I'm really proud of what we do put out there. We put a lot of work into it. And so I think at the end of it all, I would hope that that because we put a lot into what podcasts we're producing, and we try and be as factual as possible, that people would see that as a good thing and not a negative thing going forward. So that's kind of the hope, but who knows? There's people who will always hate it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I have a question. Well, first of all, I just want to say one of the things that I think makes you effective at what you do is that you are kind of vulnerable. Like if you were just stating facts, a bunch of facts, which you do share a lot of facts, but what we hear is you gasping and exclaiming. And I remember there was like an HIV episode where I think there was an incident with a giant condom.
Oh yeah,
And
put a blow up condom
over a house.
Over a house.
Yeah.
And one of you was like, "How would you even do that?"
Yeah.
You know, and
still don't know.
I think it's that human. It's that human boy, that human. I have to say vulnerability, where you're not afraid to emote and react and get involved with the material. It's not cold and clinical. And I think that's something that science writers sometimes struggle with, is the cold clinic, thinking that a cold clinical voice is a voice of expertise. And you don't use that voice. And I think it makes you very effective. Okay, I have a question. I'm not just gonna grandstand and talk about how great you are. I'm interested in the social media aspect of it. You obviously built a good audience, and you use these different platforms. Do you have any sense of which of these platforms that you used, or how the different platforms helped you build your audience?
I would say overall, in terms of building connections, Twitter has been the number one thing. We've met people over Twitter that have led to both interviews that we've gotten, and then also crossover podcast episodes that we've done, and all of that has been, there's so many cool things that people do from Twitter, like write entire books with people that they've never met except on Twitter. It's so cool, and I didn't know that you could do that before. I actually have Em to thank, because you're the one who forced me to start a Twitter, and I was like, I don't want to be on Twitter, and now I'm like on it all the time. But yeah, so that was one of the biggest things. It's also how we ended up joining the Exactly Right Network, was because we were just obnoxiously tweeting at Georgia Hardstark from My Favorite Murder, and she was like, well, I love plagues, and we're like, we do too. And that was how we ended up joining the Exactly Right Network, which is still bananas.
Yeah.
So yeah, Twitter has definitely been our most getting connections in that way. And then Instagram is the one that's the most, I think.
The most people seem to follow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of all the awesome pictures that Erin finds. So even though we post those pictures on all of our social media, Instagram is such like a visual platform that I think people really respond to that on there. So, yeah.
I have a follow-up question related to social media stuff. And I'm asking these questions because these are things I'm thinking about too. So this isn't meant to be like why aren't you doing this, or you should be doing this? But I'm curious about, if you're using all these different social media platforms, and to what extent are you thinking about issues of inclusion when you're doing that? And I don't follow your account, so you might already be doing these things, and then you should just tell us. But to what extent are you thinking about being careful of not, for instance, using digital blackface? To what extent are you making sure to provide image credits every time you share like a skeleton Saturday image? Just because inclusion, making sure to include the people who are creating that art is obviously really important. And also I'm just, again, thinking about, and of course I'm gonna now binge all of your episodes, so I'll get to learn about this in that way as well, but to what extent are you bringing in indigenous, non-Western, other types of perspectives on some of these diseases? Because of course they're happening in lots of different places. So anyway, I'll just let you answer that as you like.
Definitely for all of the pictures, when I go and try to find the pictures, I download them and I put in the picture property file all of the sources information, and if there is an artist there, I'll credit them, and if there's a date that it was made or whatever, I'll credit that as well.
Yeah.
And so that all happens on all of our posts. And then if someone does want to, I don't think we've had any cases where someone wants to actually find the original source photo, but I have the links for all of them.
Yeah.
So just to make sure, because yeah, I agree that there are so many people, and I was just at the beginning like, am I stealing? If I just post this, you know, and I do Creative Commons, and so for the most part, I go to the Welcome collection. I have like my little sources, the National Library of Medicine. I do Wikipedia or Wiki Commons and whatever information is there.
And then we do still say in all of our, what do you call those? Captions.
Yeah.
Like this one we got from National Library, this one we
Yes.
got from Welcome Collection. So
Yeah.
it's possible that we're not doing it fully correctly, but we do try.
We try, yeah.
in everything that we post. And then I, especially on Twitter, because that's where I think we do the most engagement interaction, try very hard to be cognizant of the things that we're saying and you know, who we're responding to, who we're not responding to, and things like that. And I think in terms of making sure that we like talk outside of the US, that's something that we definitely need to work on more, especially in the epidemiology section. And it gets hard because sometimes it's hard to find information from places outside the US, or at least it's easy to find information from inside the US. So that's something that we do, and we sometimes get called out on it. Like on, what was it, our Zika episode, we had a big screw up, and I was like, wow, that's just me. I never would have even thought of that. And I'm so glad that somebody pointed it out, because we're going to cover other diseases in the future that have the same distribution, and so now we know to correct in the future. Yeah. But I think that's something we definitely continue to try and work on, because diseases do affect worldwide. Yeah. And so we try and acknowledge when we're like, we realize that this time we're only talking about this from this perspective because that's what we were able to research this time. Yeah.
And that's the thing about the history too, is it's typically massive, and so I usually have to pick and choose what story I want to tell, whether it's the story of discovery or the story of an epidemic or the evolutionary history, something like that. And for the most part, I think, yeah, I have had a very US-centric history, or at least like the Western Hemisphere-centric history. And that's something that I want to try to work on, and it's something that I try to find more information of. And sometimes it comes down to where is the story that I want to tell? What is the bit of information that I want people to take away from it? And so it just is, it's a work in progress. It's something where I'm always trying to find sources from outside, but yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. Going back to the question of imposter syndrome, could you guys touch a little bit on that and kind of like how you took this from, just an idea at a barbecue to reality, and kind of how you guys continually manage your time? I know you mentioned at the beginning a lot of late nights, but yeah, I guess from idea to reality with the imposter syndrome and managing that with a busy schedule.
Yeah.
The imposter syndrome is still there.
Oh yeah. Does it ever go away? Can anyone tell?
Does anyone raise your hand?
No?
Okay.
Cool. Good to know.
But I think one of the things is that we always reassure each other. So it's really wonderful to have a partner on this project, where we do, as we mentioned, we could sort of have this opposite. Like one of us will be, in the example of today's presentation, 1 hour I would be like, okay, everything's going to be fine, it's going to be great, and you would be like,
no, I'm too nervous. We can't do this. What are we doing? Why are we in here?
And then 30 minutes later, I would be like, oh my God, I can't. You have to talk me through this.
It's fine. Don't even worry about it.
And so that's been a big way to overcome, I think, or at least battle imposter syndrome, is remembering, we do have people who email us and say, thank you so much for your podcast. We have people who listen to it. So we're doing something right. That we try to remember that. But at the same time, I think that there's a balance with imposter syndrome too, where imposter syndrome is one thing, but remembering that we're not experts is another thing. And so it's still being able to speak confidently on the information that we do gather without overstating our expertise or without underselling ourselves. And we do have a problem with underselling ourselves, I think,
sometimes.
still. Yeah. And then what was the second part of your question?
I guess how you guys continue to manage your time and keep this going.
Yeah. That's just a continual struggle that we sometimes do really well at, and then we sometimes totally fail.
Yeah, we do have division of labor now, but it's like we're just more efficient at like emails and things like that, and so we have like a checklist of things that we need to do where, it's more of a routine. Some things are very difficult, like with these vaccines episodes. It's been a lot of interviews. It's been incredibly long episodes and long editing time. really long episodes.
These ones are, yeah.
and so that's just been more time. But we also sort of, when one of us feels like we're drowning, then we tell each other, and we say, I just can't do this, we have to push this, we have to do whatever. And that's really important because I think we've recorded one episode where we've both been just wiped, and you can hear it, like, or we can hear it anyway. Hopefully you can't, I don't know. Yeah. But then it's really important to listen to yourself, I think, when that happens.
What do you know now that you wish you had known back at that barbecue?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Oh gosh.
I think I would have said, don't use Audacity, starting out.
No, that's actually very real. Get a hard drive because your computer's going to crash 100 times.
Oh my gosh, the amount of times I've had to start editing
People
again.
did tell us that too.
Yeah,
they were like, you
we just
will
didn't
lose
listen.
an entire episode, and then we lost Zika and we had to re-edit the whole thing.
It's awful.
I
knew
guess
everything then. No,
no,
we didn't.
we didn't know. I feel like we still don't know anything.
Maybe that's the problem.
I guess I don't have a good answer for this. This is a really good question, though. We need to come up with an answer for this.
We do. I think it would have been, well, if we had known back then that like this was going to be possible, this was going to be successful, then I think things would have been easier to do. Like the first episode, for instance, we didn't know what we were doing, and it was very not fun, or it was, but it was very stressful.
Well, we walked out after the first episode, and after we recorded the first episode, and we were pissed.
Yeah.
We were like, well, that sucks. Everything about this sucks.
Yeah.
I don't know what we were thinking.
Why did we buy microphones?
So I guess maybe knowing that it was going to get better and that it would get easier both to do the research and to record the episode, because that, I mean, it's less than an hour long, that episode, but we were probably in there for 3 hours.
Yeah, we were.
Recording, just being like, what are we trying to say next? Yeah. It was absolutely terrible, the first one. And then it took like several rounds of editing where we sent it to friends and we were like, is this any good? And they were like, you should probably redo these things.
Yeah, yeah.
So we learned. Yeah. But yeah, I think maybe knowing that it was going to get easier and that it was going to work.
Yes.
That's always something that you're just like, I'm going to try this thing, and we had no idea if it was going to work at all. I don't know if knowing then that it was going to work would have changed anything.
I don't know.
Less sleepless nights.
Maybe.
What's been your favorite episode to record and why?
I still think one of my favorites is smallpox.
Oh, I did like smallpox.
Smallpox was like, it was our first episode where I think we hit our stride, where we got our format the way that we now still have it.
Yeah.
That one was really fun. Oh, that one, I still really love that episode.
I feel like we had a really good time with scurvy.
Scurvy was,
yeah.
Scurvy was so fun.
Scurvy was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That one was really fun to record.
It was surprisingly interesting, really. Scurvy's a great one, guys.
We've had fun recording a lot of the episodes.
Yeah.
I think the worst one was
influenza.
Well, okay, I forgot about that.
What was the other one?
I was gonna say yellow fever, because we did two in one day, or like one right after another or something, and it was like 9 o'clock in the morning, so we're like, we're not actually gonna drink this quarantini.
Right.
So then we didn't have a quarantini to record with, which like, I'm just all pussy burritos at this point.
Right.
It's not quite as much fun, quite honestly. But yeah, I think some of those early ones were really fun. Scurvy was really fun.
Scurvy
I
was
forgot
fun.
about that.
Prions was good.
Prions was fun.
I mean, they're all kind of fun. They all have their special little fun moments, but Scurvy was
It's a good feeling when you walk out of our back bedroom. And you're like, oh, that's going to be a good episode.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. I think our time is up.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, fun with scurvy. Maybe that will be the sequel. Our next speaker, Brent Roberts, is here to talk about how to test research. And he's written that there's no better way to test research results than to have another team of scientists test the ideas and test them in a well-powered, pre-registered direct replication study. So it's more teamwork. Brent Roberts is a psychology professor. He chairs the Social and Behavioral Sciences Research Initiative at the University of Illinois. That initiative supports newer faculty members and intends to enhance collaboration between behavioral and social science researchers on large-scale interdisciplinary projects. One of his major focuses is on reproducibility in science. So here to speak about how to avoid amplifying the iffy science is Professor Brent Roberts. Thank you, Brent.
We're almost there. I'm between you and the last session with Dan Simons and May Berenbaum. It should be a great one, so I'll try to get done quickly. I usually start my talks with one apology. I get to give you two this time. So as you might already have noticed, one of my fatal flaws is I talk too fast. So my most consistent and ongoing evaluation in my classes is, seems to have a weird obsession with methods, TTF. Digresses almost every lecture, TTF. And so I will talk too fast. That is a bad thing, and I apologize for that. The second thing I need to apologize for is that I have it on good judgment, meaning Diana Yates has told me that both my written prose and my oral prose is like a word salad sandwich stuffed with a bunch of sprouts made up of jargon without any mayo. So it's going to be dry. This is one of those odd situations where two negatives actually make a positive, so you'll have a lot of word salad sandwich and it'll go quickly. But this is another way of saying that I would welcome any questions at any time. We have amazing speakers here and have had amazing speakers. It seems the norm so far has been to wait until the end to ask questions. Don't feel so compelled with my talk. My talk is also a little bit different than the others. I had the task or the challenge of following up all these excellent speakers with some material, and I thought I would go about things in a slightly different way. So things are pretty pragmatic in this case. And also, I just wanted to say as an aside, it was a bit poignant listening to the imposter syndrome discussion because, hey, I'm 25 years in and I still have it. So if you figure out how to get rid of it, I'll be very curious. Okay. There's two numbers that cause me a lot of distress, 600 and 450. You probably don't understand the significance of these numbers, but let me explain to you why I find them problematic. The first is that there have been over 600 research articles published on the idea of ego depletion. I'll discuss this in a little more detail in a few slides. That's a lot of research, right? We saw yesterday that there's 1.8 million publications each year, which is a lot more than I would have liked. But there's 600 that have been generated over the last 2 decades on this idea. This idea is dear to my heart in some respects because it's related to the topic that I study, conscientiousness and self-control. It's also started by one of the luminaries of my field, described by a graduate student as the most important psychologist in existence at a point a few years ago. And this idea came out at the key point of his career, right? He was a bit past mid-career, prolific writer, really, really famous, and he came out with this really cool idea with crazy, fun operationalizations, and it just took off. For 2 decades, it just ruled the psychological space in my guild. And he said, in no uncertain terms just last year, there's probably about 600 papers that have been published on that idea. Second thing to consider, over 450 research articles have been published showing the existence of candidate gene or candidate gene by environment interactions on human depression. This is out of the psychiatric research. So you have 2 different guilds, psychologists and psychiatrists, some biologists and geneticists involved in the lower tier, right? We're in the genome era, right? We discovered the human genome, we decoded it. It seems like every week we find out something new about the human genome. This is one of the most popular areas to do research. Why are these 2 things problematic? Well, we've recently learned through what I would call definitive research that both of these ideas are not true, or are, let's say, not accurate. So there was some conversation with Chris Fraley's talk about meta-analyses. So the meta-analyses of ego depletion seem to show an effect. But if you go to Dan Simon's world, where he does these things called registered replication reports, which are definitive studies, you register what you're going to do beforehand, you plan it out with a broad team of researchers, in this case from across the globe, and you run the study after it's passed through quality control without ever looking at the data. You have other people, Dan has other people analyze the data than the original teams who collected it. He monitors the quality and the whole process. And there are over 60 studies published just recently, and that showed the effect size for ego depletion is 0, or indistinguishable from 0. The meta-analyses show a rather robust effect. So there's 600 papers on ego depletion that exist in the literature that are, let's say, charitably inaccurate. When it comes to genes, candidate genes and G by E studies, you have lots of studies there because, of course, NIH said with no uncertain terms, if you are going to be a scientist and you're going to contribute to our portfolio in health, you got to do one of two things: fMRIs and see if the brain lights up when something happens, or assess genes. I did this myself. I got a decent amount of funds from the National Institute of Health, in large part because I promised to do G by E interaction tests of health and conscientiousness across a life course. And halfway through, we quit because we were at that point discovering that there was a problem. Really nice study that just came out literally last week by Border et al. 600,000 people in the sample, really, really, really definitive methods, codifying and showing, ironically, what the geneticists told us back in 1985 was the case, that you're not going to find any candidate genes with humans. Not candidate gene polymorphisms that would have a notable effect size to create a phenotype like depression. You'll find thousands of them, right, that'll do this, but not any one. There are 450 studies in existence in the journals right now that if you're an unsuspecting researcher and you pop it into Google Scholar, you'll get what looks like an amazingly robust portfolio of substantive research showing that there are candidate genes linked to depression and candidate gene by environment interactions linked to depression. And none of them can be true. So you've heard a couple people say one of the solutions to our problem with iffy science is make sure you talk to other people. Good luck with that. If you have 1,000 research reports, let's just think a little bit. I want you to dwell on this a little bit because the significance of it for me is quite profound. Many of you are researchers. How long does it take you to do a study? In my field, half-life of about 3 years, right? If you're a graduate student, you're cranking away, working as hard as you can. If you're working on that coin flip study that Dr. Fraley talked about, meaning one of these, how hard will it be to get that to go? You get a finding. And I'm not questioning the findings. I think these people dug significant p-values out of the data. And they probably worked very hard to do so. So I'm not saying that they're frauds at all. In fact, I think they're probably just like the rest of us, hardworking, unsuspecting researchers thinking there's something there, following the incentives. NIH says you have to do genetics work. The luminary of a field says, this is my cool idea, right? And everybody says, hey, he's got a cool idea. I'm going to do this too, right? And then the incentive structure says, publish what he said to publish because that's how you get tenure. That's how you get a job, right? That's the incentive structure that you follow. And at least 1,000 teams did that and found things that weren't true. You're a reporter and you're trying to do due diligence and you go say, well, I'm going to talk to other people. Well, the whole group is going to be on board. It's going to be very difficult to find people who say, oh, ego depletion. 10 years ago, you would find people say, well, some people find it, some people don't.
Are you going to explain what ego depletion is?
Eventually, yeah. I don't want to mischaracterize it. It's cool, it's Freudian. It's not true. I feel like I'm a little bit ambivalent about investing too much in the definition. Yeah.
Just to clarify, make sure I'm hearing you properly. So doctors often ask, did your grandpa have depression, your grandma and your parents? Are you saying that based on what you've seen, that there may not be a genetic predisposition for depression necessarily?
Saying something even more horrible, that there's a genetic predisposition, but the techniques and the methods that have been operationalized to find them are not the right ones. So, yeah, of course there is. And what the geneticists are telling us now is if you really want to know about this, you're going to have to investigate or interrogate, as I like to say, the whole DNA strand. and find thousands and thousands of polymorphisms that are linked to this that are not of much utility, right? It's better to ask, did you have parents who got depressed, than it is to do your genome analysis at 23andMe, right? If you want to know whether you're going to Alzheimer's, your fMRI study is not going to tell you. Asking whether you have parents who had Alzheimer's or grandparents is going to tell you. So a lot of these studies promoted by the idea that we're going to find truth in biology or truth in these big ideas end up going nowhere, but we have incentive structures that reward that, so we follow that. So I'm here to tell you that that's why these numbers disturb me, right? Because if there's this idea that all we have to do is do a little more due diligence, ask a couple of statistics nerds like Chris Fraley, you know, tell me what's wrong with the study, he may not be able to tell you because it might look like a good study. Because the incentive structure is such that if you find that study and it's got a p-value and it says the idea that you think it says, it's going to get published. If you don't have the p-value, good luck to you. It's going to go in the file drawer, right? And it can happen to such a degree that you really have whole fields defined for decades. And that is the state of the science we're kind of in. So I think that's a little more problematic. You saw this, of course, this morning and yesterday in some of the other talks. So what do you do about this? Many of you are researchers, many of you are not. Should we force you to take lots and lots of classes from people like Dr. Fraley or Dr. Simons? I love his power lecture, but I also am sensitive to the fact that there are certain parts where I just phase out. And I posted it on Twitter, and then all the Bayesians started going off on him, and there's all these stats nerds who are going back and forth and arguing. Yeah, it's really hard to get those people to get on board. It's hard to learn that stuff. Do all of us have to go back to graduate school to get a PhD in statistics? You know, that's kind of implied by a lot of folks. If you follow the conversation for the crisis in science for reproducibility, the go-to thing is education. We need to teach you how to do this. And I'm sensitive to the fact that that's not easy, and not easy even for us. There might be something in between. And so instead of giving you the course of how you should go about looking at the science in a more detailed fashion, I wanted to do something a little, let's say, a bridge between where you're at and where we're at, and maybe provide you with some guides to help things out. So, and I realized, in thinking about it, that this is us every week in our reading group. So we always have these reading groups where we read a paper each week, or we see the journal send out the articles, and we read through the abstracts and go, oh, really? That got published in Psych Science? That got published in PNAS? That's fascinating. So that's me, that's Chris, that's Jamie Derringer. Each week we have this reading group, and we always have this kind of reaction. And I realized that the reaction was because it didn't take a lot for us to scope out problematic research. It doesn't take computational neuroscience. It doesn't take a statistics degree. There are lots of signals in the studies that can be used to at least raise questions. So I thought it would be productive to, let's say, communicate that to you. What are the heuristics we use? We just read through an abstract and go, oh, okay. Or read through a method section pretty quick. We can go, okay, this is a study that we probably don't want to invest in. And we don't have to do the hard math, the hard numbers, the computations that Dan will teach you in his class. There's some things that you can see and that you can use to, let's say, start a dialogue about what science is robust or not. I have to give a shout out to Brian Nosek, who turned me on to this book, Atul Gawande's book on checklists. So checklists are wonderful, right? We can teach you these ideas. I'm sure you remember everything from Chris Fraley's lecture about power, right? If I asked you a quiz right now, you would know. No, right? We don't remember things. If you want to remember things and you want to keep them useful, checklists are awesome. So pilots use checklists, thank God. That's why most of the planes don't fall out of the sky, right? Doctors use checklists and hopefully don't leave scalpels inside you when they do surgery. And checklists are good for that. They externalize the knowledge, they keep it there, and they systematize it in a way that let you kind of do things in an organized fashion. For those of us who are not conscientious, this is a great way to have conscientiousness imported into our psyche. And so what I thought was I would make you a checklist. So the IFFY science detection checklist, okay? The goal is to guide those of us who are less methodologically focused to identify IFFY science in a handy checklist format. So that's what I'm going to do. It's very mundane, very straightforward, not a lot of narrative turns, not many pretty pictures, just very pragmatic. And I'll walk through each of these things. Okay, so here's the checklist as it currently stands. You have 8 items and 8 questions. Is the sample size small? Is it only one study? Do they fail to directly replicate their own work? For multi-study papers, this was multi-study studies, but Dan Simons protested because he doesn't like that. I love multi-study studies because it sounds good. If you have multi-study studies, do the sample sizes bounce around for no obvious reason? Did they test hypotheses without pre-registering them? Do they only offer conceptual replications? Are all of the p-values between 0.1 and 0.01, do they fail to present effect sizes and interpret them for you? So this is the checklist. I'm going to go through each of these with some investment where needed. Okay? How small is small? Chris Fraley gave you pretty much the definition of how small is small. But as he alluded to in his talk, he tailored his talk and was kind enough to leave for me the more pragmatic information about how you might calibrate what small is. So you need to switch the question in my mind. What is the sample size of this study designed to detect? That is the kind of power question, right? And we can give you the arcane effect sizes. I don't want you to focus on that because we've actually done enough research to know what the effect sizes are for things that we all can see, that we can understand without having a PhD. And we can use that information, you can use that information to ask the question, okay, this study says it has 200 people in it. What's that designed to actually detect? It has 20 people in it. What's this study designed to detect? And I'm going to give you anecdotal and concrete examples of that. These are intuitive standards. Is the sample size too small to answer that question is the important follow-up question, right? So, past behavior predicts future behavior, okay? The latest estimate of this is that it's a really big effect size, 0.8. It only takes 11 people to really reliably, with enough adequate power, detect that effect, okay? That's cool. Studies of 11 people. Men being taller than women on average, something that we can see. That takes about 30 people, okay? So those two are really cool because past behavior, future behavior, if you've seen one of my talks, you've seen them all, right? Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Right? We do things very consistently across time. It's not too hard to see that. Men being taller than women, nothing ambiguous about that. We can see it on average. It's something that people can see. It's not subtle, right? I want to stop here for a little bit because 30 is not an unusual sample size, right? That's actually big for a lot of the studies that we see. And that means that when you see a study that says, I'm going to compare this group and the total sample size is 30, they are saying that the effect that they are looking at is the same size as men and women being different in height. It's something you could see with the naked eye. If you're getting smaller than that, they're saying, look, this is something so obvious that it's like past behavior predicting future behavior, okay? I like to dive into other literatures. I'm a little bit obsessed with exercise and nutrition research, and I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to see the headline where it says, new exercise routine guarantees this possible outcome. You know, high intensity training will reform your entire health and spectrum. You go to the study, it's in N of 20. 10 people will exercise this way, and then 10 people exercise that way. Oh man, there's nothing there for me to find. Another nutrition study that compares this diet to that diet, 20 people total. They're assuming that the effects of vegetarianism or some type of vegetarianism is going to be as big as men and women being different in height. Okay, so a lot of our research is in this category, and that should be acknowledged. And that's the first sign that, hey, maybe you might want to think about that. As a reporter, if you're following up on that study, you go, hey, you think this difference is as big as men and women being the same height or not the same height? Yeah. It's a nice follow-up question in some respects. Liking eggs and eating egg salad. Basic attitudinal question, right? I like eggs, I eat egg salad, right? Do you like something? Do you do something? The correlation is actually pretty low from some respects, right? What we say and what we do are often two different things. I am liberal, I vote liberal, right? I'm conservative, I vote conservative. Attitude, behavior correlations are not, they're big by many standards, but they're not huge, right? So if you take any type of thing that's an attitude-behavior relationship, you're going to need at least 50 people in that study to be well-powered from a Dr. Fraley perspective to actually ask the question, okay? So that's what it's designed to do. I love this one. This came out recently. For those of us who've had kids, the effect of the first child on maternal sleep time is it's negative 44 minutes, right? My wife was like, no way, it's way higher than that. Individual differences, you know. And it's actually only a correlation of 0.27. You need at least 100 people to reliably detect the effect of having a kid on the loss of sleep that you get. Okay? So think about that. That's cool, right? That, if you've had kids, that's an intuitive effect size. That's one you can appreciate. And you need at least 100 people to see that. This one is disturbing for most of us, especially if we're getting older. Taking NSAIDs or taking ibuprofen to relieve your pain it doesn't have a very big effect size, right? You're going to need 350 folks to detect that effect. And so, if it's a small effect, it takes more people. If a sample is upwards of 300 folks, it has the power, it has the ability to detect something like that. And then my personal favorite, which is one that I had to throw in here for you, which is the actual relation of birth order to personality is a correlation of 0.03. If you really want to investigate that, you need 8,000 people, not your family. For those of you who are firstborns, suck it up. You're not different than your little brothers and sisters.
I'm sorry, I'm confused about the effect size column.
Yeah, you could ignore that.
I thought that's the effect size when you have that many
No,
subjects?
so that's the effect size of these types
Okay.
of
Okay.
so these are kind of things
So-
we know about. So somebody went about and said, okay, let's look at all the data on height. And here's the average difference between men and women. It translates into a correlation of 0.67. So you can translate any type of statistic into any type of effect size metric. I'm using correlation just to be consistent. Dr. Fraley talked about D metrics. There's other metrics that you can use. The simplest ones are correlations and Ds, but I don't want to get into that. I just want you to have this kind of intuitive scaling, right? So that when you see a study reported and you go to that study, oh wait, I forgot to say this. The assumption here is that you are going to read the study. Not the scientists are like, bah. Not the Twitter title, not the abstract, but the method section of the study. If you're not interested in that, you're not going to do that, go onto Facebook, do whatever you need to do. I'll be done in about 20 minutes, okay? Because this really does assume that you're going to read the actual study, because you have to decide or to be able to determine what's going on. Yeah.
So this is a good frame of reference for studies on, I guess, human behavior and differences, but presumably, if you're studying something like plants, where you have a lot more control over the environment, I guess you could almost make your own chart, and it might look different. Like maybe I don't need 8,000 plants to detect, something that's over there.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of studies, or a lot of fields, for example, have homogeneous gene pools. If you have clones and they're all the same genes, then you've controlled the denominator on your variability, and they have less variability. I'm not talking about those, but nonetheless, I would say some people haunt me because I really love evolutionary biology, and I love the eco-evo folks, and I love the people in our biology department and what they do with animal behavior, and I follow them, but their sample sizes are wicked small. And I don't know their field well enough to know, right? It might be that they have homogeneous gene pools and it's fine, right? There's ways of making the effect size bigger. Lots of observations can do that. Homogeneous gene pools can do that. But if you're going about doing these studies and you're using small sample sizes, this is one of the issues. I would say this is a standard that pretty much fits social and behavioral science, economics, political science, psychology, psychiatry, much of biology, epidemiology, right? There's not many fields that this type of metric doesn't fit. I think they're very particular domains. Dr. Simons will say to the end of his day that his field is different because they do massive within subject designs. They reduce their error, right? So that's possible. But if you're talking about generic research, the stuff you see in health, the things you see in exercise, nutrition, political science, economics, these are all fair game. Okay. Yeah.
The one about liking eggs and eating egg salad, I'm assuming that you determine if the person eats egg salad or likes it by a survey, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these studies are survey-based, and I'm surprised it takes 48 people to find that out. I'm surprised it takes that you have to look at 30 people to figure out that men are generally taller.
Yeah.
But
on
when you get
on
in,
average. There's lots of tall women. My daughter, man, she towers.
and the sleep effect, you got to look at 100 people.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk about, once you add surveys to science that humans are answering, does it get a lot more complicated?
No. I mean, I don't think it gets more complicated. And I mean, what you're highlighting in some respects was something that led to a crisis of confidence in the fields back in the 1960s. So the attitudes researchers, for example, saw the same thing and went, wait a minute, it's only 0.37. It should be bigger than that. Well, it's not. And they've done it every which way but loose. If you take an attitude, which is a self-report, and you look at behavior, however you want to measure it, the relationship is not one. What we say, you might find this really surprising. It doesn't necessarily predict what we do, right? We often do things contrary to what we say about ourselves. And that's a fact. And it doesn't really, let's say, get biased by whether it's a survey or not. And that, it was very awkward for social psychology in the 60s. I think they've addressed it pretty well by accepting the fact that that's the way it works. And then they've gone through for 20 or 30 years trying to figure out why that is. So you're right, it is small. But that's also kind of the reality. And I was actually surprised like you with this sleep study. I was like, oh, because for me, like the psychological weight of sleep deprivation from my kids was huge. Now that wasn't what they asked, it was how much time was lost. But 45 minutes is pretty significant, right? Cumulatively, it might be profound. But in terms of that difference, on average, you need about 100 people to reliably detect it. And so just as a calibration factor, that's a good, let's say, comparator, so to speak. Okay, so I'll go through a couple of studies in psychology that are rather famous. So one of the most famous for us is the ESP study, published in 2011. If you don't know about it, thank God. It was a 9-study study showing the existence of ESP, that people could predict the future without knowing it. And for many of us, it was a watershed moment because when you read the study, you realized that the methods in that paper were exactly the same as the methods in the paper before and the methods in the paper after, whose topics were kind of benign, like egg salad and eating eggs, right? Nothing exciting. But they all use the same methods. If you could use the same methods and arrive at the conclusion that ESP is real, there's a problem, right? And we realized at that point, a lot of us realized at that point that was really a problem. What's interesting is if you go into the study and you look at what he did, this is Daryl Bem, in terms of a design, his design assumes that ESP is the same size as that effect of having your first kid. So if you know that, right, you just have to look at the sample size. You go, oh, okay, this study has 100 people. Oh, then it's assuming that it has the same effect of having a kid on sleep deprivation. Okay. And then you say, does ESP, which is apparently so subtle that none of us can actually detect it, but only he can in his laboratory, that subtle thing is the same effect size, same size as sleep deprivation from your first kid? It, let's say, raises a question, right? In hindsight, we know this study wasn't necessarily true. He still argues that, but many people have attempted to replicate this and have not. A study that I put in here for Ed Yong, this is his kind of coming out study for psychology. So he alluded to the fact that he had written really cool blogs when he was young, many of which became the favored blogs for psychology, and especially for the priming literature in psychology. So John Barge is famous for this work. One of his most famous studies is where students would de-scramble words, and about 15 of the words in the list would be old words. And if you de-scrambled a word into an old word, and then you were followed later, you would walk slowly. Because old people walk slowly, right? And, oh, that's cool. I used to use this study in my methods courses because, of course, I was trying to make it interesting because methods is not interesting. And it's like, check out what we can do. We're psychologists. Isn't this awesome? You can subtly prime people, and you can change their objective behavior. He measured the time with which they walked down the hall out of the lab. Well, he only had 30 people in the study, which assumed, of course, that that's the same as the difference between men and women in terms of height. So obviously, in hindsight, it now is easy. We've tried to replicate this. It doesn't replicate. But it also begs the question straight off the bat. If you're doing something this subtle and you have a sample size that small, it's not going to allow you to detect the effect you assume it's there. Power posing, another one that has been famous in the literature as of late, which is the idea that if you... I was back here behind the desk like this. My testosterone went up, and I'm ready to go. So the original power posing study, which is a fascinating entire enterprise in the sociology of science, had 42 people in it. And that study assumes that doing something like raising your hands for 30 seconds before a talk is going to have an effect on testosterone that's equivalent to an attitude and behavior correlation. Okay? So that's where I think these kinds of standards can be useful for you. You can use them to ask questions. Like, wait a minute, that's the sample size. Should I assume it should have an effect that's that big? Okay? I'm not telling you this is easy, so back to the question that was asked about having different fields and different standards. Some of you might have seen this recent study looking at 5 different diets and cardiovascular disease. Really cool. 16,000 people. No, not really. Really only 363, which is the number of people who actually had a cardiovascular event. And they were divided into 5 groups, which means you have actually a pretty small sample in the focal groups that you're trying to analyze. So they were saying that different diets had the same effect size as attitude behavior relations, which is possible, but by knowing that, you might ask the question, was this study really well designed to tease this apart? Is it really going to be that big a difference to be a pescatarian, a vegetarian, or a vegan when it comes to cardiovascular disease? And did we have enough people in the category that counts, people who actually had a cardiovascular event, to tease this apart? So you can't just look at the sample size in the abstract, you have to read the paper, because 16,000 seems big. It's not. Okay. Is it only one study? We've already talked about this, the single study problem in science. The provocative small study that finds that effect, that starts off a whole stream of research. Who might this hurt? This guy. So why? And this is my plea not to be covered by the press. So most of my work, for example, is descriptive and single study. So we do a lot of okay, we found the first 50-year longitudinal study of personality development in existence. And we're going to tell you what we found. It's not definitive. It's got a weird measure. It's a weird sample. It's really cool. That's my research. So I'm not here telling you that I walk the walk, right? That I'm free of biases and I don't do these bad things. I do these too. I stand up here as somebody who does single studies almost all the time. That's my gig, okay? But in general, single studies are weak evidence for whatever it is we're trying to look at. Okay, do they fail to directly replicate their own study? Third grade science, right? You ask the third graders, what do you do with science? You do the experiment, then you do it again so that they can find out whether it's true or not. The incentive structure within science in general has really divorced itself from this idea. We have ongoing debates about whether we should be directly replicating our work. We have psychologists who are out there saying, no, direct replications are boring, they're uncreative, they impede progress. Well, that's malarkey, right? It's not hard to replicate your own work, so my proposal is at the very least, scientists should be able to replicate their own work. That's a start. It's not great. The most definitive thing is, of course, for independent labs to replicate what we do and for those people to do it. There are institutions starting to be created, like the AMPS journal that Dan Simons runs, and the idea of the registered report or the registered replication report, where people are working as teams to try to replicate existing scientific studies. That's done in cancer, it's done in social science, it should be done in more fields. It's a really nice enterprise, and it could potentially transform our field. But if you see a study and it doesn't have any direct replication of anything, it's not strong science, it's iffy. Okay, for multi-study studies, do the sample sizes bounce around for no obvious reason? So here I'll give you a definition of ego depletion, if you don't mind. So this is a study that we are very comfortable criticizing. It's failed to replicate a number of times. It's been reanalyzed and shown to be a problem. It is a famous study in the ego depletion research because it married the biological and the psychological, which is what every psychologist wants to do. So ego depletion is the idea, out of Freud, that the ego, which we don't necessarily invoke all the time, but Baumeister did, has a certain source of energy and it's limited. And if you use it, you'll deplete yourself, right? And so exerting self-control, keeping yourself from doing something will make you tired. And that will make you perform worse on some second task. That is ego depletion. You have depleted your energy stores, your psychic energy stores. Isn't that cool? I mean, he brought Freud back. We had dumped Freud big time, right? Except in our overview courses, because it talks about sex and the undergraduates love that. But if you stop teaching the old dead men routine, right, you would go to ego depletion, and it kind of resurrected Freud in a nice, soft way. Isn't this cool? Ego depletion. It's there. It's just like Freud said. And again, we had 3 decades of research on that, right? And this study was really cool because it said consuming glucose, Gatorade, would rejuvenate you. You would suddenly be restored and be able to perform well on the second task as you did on the first. And it was like, oh, that's cool. Was the evidence compelling? Yeah, look at this. 9 studies. Study 1, study 2, study 3. So, as you can see, we got over the single study thing in psychology in a big way. We went for the multi-study thing in a bigger way. Because, of course, that's good science, right? Right? I mean, it's impressive. I remember seeing the editor say this back in the late 80s, that we need to go to a multi-study format. And all of us said, damn, no more career for me, right? And this became the norm. 4 to 9 studies in every paper showing this amazing, robust effect. Now, the weird thing you see here is look at the way those sample size bounce around. 110, 12, 17, 62, 18. Makes absolutely no sense, right? And if you look at the assumed effect size, you do the first study and you find an effect size. Every study has an effect size. I don't care what you do. You're going to find an effect size in it. You can if you bother to look at it. And then you say, I'm not going to use that information. No, I'm just going to throw it away. In the second study, I'm going to assume twice as large. What the heck, right? I mean, again, back to the fact that all of us are working really hard in our labs trying to find truth, and some of us harder than others, right? And you're running study after study over years doing these things, and you divorce yourself from the information you got from the last study? Makes no sense whatsoever, okay? So if you see this pattern where things bounce around, it's a really nice indicator of iffy science. Why is it a problem? It's an indirect indicator of what we call p-hacking. So in this case, data peaking. So data peaking is where you're collecting the subjects and you're looking at the data as it comes in. And when the threshold of p less than 0.05, the magical barrier gets crossed, you stop collecting data. Voila. And then you close the presses, write it up, and that's your study. Run the next study, keep on going, and you might get a different n, right? It might be 50 instead of 25. So this bouncing p-value is one of the indirect indicators of an approach that is problematic if you don't adjust for it. There are ways if you are into doing that. You might have a high need for quality control, or there might be lots of money being spent on the enterprise that you're into, and so you want to watch. There are ways you can do that are legitimate. Talk to Dan Simons, he'll tell you what to do. But most people don't do that, and when you see the published study like this, there's probably a problem. Okay? It's also weirdly contrary, as I alluded to the information you get. If you find a study and you find an effect size, you should use that to plan what you're going to do next. I mean, I mow my lawn, it takes 45 minutes. It's like me saying, okay, last week it was 45 minutes. Next week I'll plan for 5. Cool, I'll be done. And the week after that, I'll spend an hour and a half mowing my lawn. It just makes absolutely no sense to not use the information you get from experience to inform the studies you do in the future. And when you see that pattern, that's what the person is admitting to. Okay, did they test hypotheses without pre-registering them? The old joke, since I'm old, is that we would see these papers be published, we'd read the title, we'd look at the abstract and be like, wow, priming people with words makes them walk slower? That's crazy. I wonder if they sent those hypotheses out in registered mail, right? Some of us are old enough to remember what registered mail is. And the joke was basically that people were not actually confessing to the fact that they made things up as they went along. This is what we call harking, hypothesizing after the results are known, right? So you do the study, find the p-value, and then make up the story afterwards. Not cool, right? Again, it's fun. In my world, from my perspective, it's totally fine for you to do this. Just replicate the study. If you want to dig around and stuff, explore like crazy in your data, find something, I think you should have complete freedom to do that. I don't want to monitor you. I don't want to regulate you. Do whatever you want. Don't tell me you hypothesized it beforehand, right? And replicate it if you can. We used to joke about sending the hypotheses out via registered mail. Sorry, you just poke around the data until you find a p-value of unusual size. Sorry. An allusion to my namesake, the Dread Pirate Roberts. So you don't need registered mail anymore because you have amazing resources with the internet. The most prominent being the Open Science Framework, where you can register every hypothesis you want at any time you want. So if you have an idea, you're sitting in lab, you're having a conversation with your PI, you're the PI, you have an idea, and you want to test that idea, and you want to test it as a hypothesis, you have absolutely nothing stopping you from pre-registering that. If you are going to test a hypothesis and you're going to use a p-value, there's some allusion to the fact that in certain cases we don't want to do that, we want to do estimation. Look at the literature. There's not many of us who don't use p-values. If you're using a p-value, they're not descriptive items. They're testing hypotheses. It's not called null hypothesis significance testing for no reason, right? You're testing hypotheses. If you're testing hypotheses, then the hypothesis is supposed to be antecedent to the activity. If you made it up afterwards, it's not a hypothesis. The p-value isn't of any value, right? And now we have the easiest possible ways of doing the work you need to do. So if you are going to do it, you may not do it. You may be like an estimator, right? You may be somebody who's saying, look, I just want to know the relationship between birth order and personality. I'm not going to put a p-value on it. I'm just going to tell you what the number is. That's fine. That's great. Good luck getting it published, because most of the scientists want you to test a hypothesis and will get a little bit upset with you when you don't have p-values in your paper. If you are going to do p-values, you're supposed to set a hypothesis. If you're going to do a hypothesis, it's best to do it before you collect the data. You have the vehicles now to do that. Open science is one. As predicted, which Dan doesn't like, is another. There are 3 or 4 others that if you'd like to, you can just get on the web and immediately write down what you're going to do. So there's no, let's say, barrier to that. At this point, if you want to test hypothesis, you have every opportunity to do so. What if you're going to do exploratory analysis? Fine. Pre-register that. We do that all the time. We're just going to explore, right? What happens if things go awry? Your pre-registration isn't well articulated. You change your mind. Update it. Tell people what you're going to do. It's an act of transparency. It's saying, this is what's going on in my data. This is what I'm doing in my process, right? Remember, one of the values we have is openness, honesty, right? Accountability. The way we stay open, honest, and accountable is by saying, this is the process that occurred. If you hide that, then it's not open or accountable. You have the resources and the tools to do so now. Transparency is transparently available to all scientists. Do they only offer conceptual replications? This is a little, let's say, particular to psychology, but I do think it's particular to other fields too. A direct replication, as you know, is just trying to do the same thing twice, preferably methodologically as close to it as possible. I'm not going to get into the philosophical debates about whether, for example, in psychology, it's possible to do a direct replication, because next semester is different than this semester. These psychology undergraduates are different than those psychology undergraduates. There's no true direct replication. But pragmatically speaking, it's like, I did this experiment, I'm going to do it again with kind of the same population. That's a direct replication, nothing creative. A conceptual replication is anything that's not, right? Different outcome, different manipulation. If you go back to the Gaio study, 9 studies, all of them not completely different, all of them conceptual replications. None of them direct. You have different ways of making people tired in the first 2 studies, different outcomes and different manipulations in the next 4 studies, different ways of giving glucose, and different outcomes in the last 3 studies. No direct replication of any of the studies that were presented. Okay? So you don't know whether they could get the same thing twice. And they will say to you, look, it's impressive, 9 studies. They're all kind of conceptually replicated, right? And that's what we've used for years to justify this approach. What's wrong with that? It might be another sign of problematic behavior. So in this case, selectively reporting results. If you don't confess to all the studies you ran, the ones that didn't have p-values of unusual size, you can put together a package of studies curated from your lab that all have statistically significant findings, that all kind of look the same way. And that's rewarded because we want to see significance, right? That's our value system. Should be statistically significant. If it's not true. And it should be reliable. So I should see that across every single study. So you find people tossing out studies that don't work. Suddenly those studies become pilot studies, right? Or maybe something just went wrong on that one. So let's get rid of that. It's almost impossible to publish non-significant conceptual replications, because the original authors become the reviewers, and they say, oh, this is a crappy way to test my idea, right? So you have this wonderful, wicked system that self-perpetuates. So the failures to conceptually replicate never get published, and therefore you never see them. Okay. Are all the p-values between 0.1 and 0.01? This is really easy. I mean, if you look in the results, you'll usually see people reporting p-values. If they're like this, again, the Guyota study, 0.02, 0.03, 0.01, 0.06, what's wrong with that? Well, that is actually statistically incredibly rare. And so Dr. Fraley talked about the work of Greg Francis and the system he developed to test whether this was rare or not. And it turns out that the distribution of p-values, when there is an effect, doesn't support being able to do that. It becomes infinitesimally small in terms of probability to find that kind of pattern where every p-value is just a little bit over or in and around the threshold of alpha. Okay? And so if you see that, red flag. That's a problem. This is the graph that Dan Simons will show you, that as the power of your study goes up, the percentage of p-values near 0.05 plummets, right? Because you have a real effect. And when you have a real effect and you have adequate power to test it, the p-values get really, really, really small, 0.0000001, right? And you get a lot more of those than you get these just crawling over the ledge of less than 0.05. So if you see these clumps of p-values in and around 0.05 or whatever threshold they've set, that's a red flag too. Okay. Do they fail to present effect sizes and interpret them for you? So I've given you one interpretive framework. There are many of them in the field. There are many different ways of doing this. And there are many levels of doing it poorly. So bad, just p-values. So there are many fields, especially medical research, where all you see is p-values. And that's a real problem. Because p-values come from two things. They come from the effect size and the sample size. It's not just a clean indicator of whether there's something there. There are two things that can get you there in combination. Okay? So it's not much information. Less bad is p-values, effect sizes, but no interpretation. Better, p-values plus effect sizes with some normative interpretation. Best, p-values plus effect sizes with some attempts to translate into an intuitive metric. Okay? Let me give you examples. Bad, so G by E effect of serotonin transporter gene polymorphism on depression. In the abstract, p less than 0.00002, right? The meta-analysis question, this is a meta-analysis, right? How did they get that p-value? It's a sample size of 50,000 people. The real effect size was a correlation of 0.02. That is actually 10 times larger than it really is. Okay? They were going through the data of the published research. That's the other problem with meta-analyses. They are a cataloging of the existing research, which if it is inflated in terms of its effect size, will be inaccurate. So meta-analyses, by definition, are inaccurate if we haven't published all of the data. So I'll add one addendum to Dr. Fraley's description of good meta-analysis. It's one that also gets the grade data, right? The publications in dissertations or the papers that were never published because they weren't statistically significant. That's a nice indicator of a good meta-analysis, but it's hard to do that. Okay, less bad. In some of Guyot's studies, they reported effect sizes, which if you look through the paper, it's like, wow, okay. They reported effect sizes of correlations of 0.6, 0.7, which if you had any methodological training, you read that study, you would have went, wait a minute, that's way too big. But nobody did, because they didn't bother. They just kind of said, that's what they are, and that's a problem. Better, the association of screen time and well-being in teenagers is small by social science standards. These are actually the true numbers for those of you who are running around telling your kids to get off their phones, or you're saying that their cell phone is going to melt their brain, or it's going to melt your brain. I think it's actually going to melt our brain, the older people's brains, way before the teenagers. But nonetheless, if you look at the effect sizes in the standards of social science, the effect sizes are really, really small. Correlations of 0.05 to 0.1 in general. And then best, at most, only 4%, 0.4% of adolescent well-being is related to screen use, which only slightly surpasses the negative effect of regularly eating potatoes, with sincere apologies to the potato lovers in the room, right? And so these people went about, a different way of looking at comparative metrics for effect sizes and said, okay, what else do we have in the data? Well, in these surveys, we have whether they ate French fries or chips. Lo and behold, eating potatoes is actually quite problematic. Okay. So that's your iffy science detection checklist. It is not fully validated yet. We don't know how to score it yet. What's a bad score? Dan Simon says 1, which might be extreme. I give it to you just to be able to give you some opportunity to entertain a conversation or a dialogue with scientists, whether you're a scientist and reading other people's research or whether you're a reporter trying to report on other people's research. Here are some questions that you could ask. Is the sample size small? Why did you use that sample size? For multi-study studies, did it bounce around? What was your strategy for recruiting participants? Did they test hypotheses without pre-registering? Did you pre-register your hypotheses? So I've provided you a set of questions that you can use just to converse with the PI. Is this a realistic thing given what we know? So I don't want to necessarily propose this as a index that they can have a score on, like a DSM score for depression. But this is a set of items that you can use that don't require PhD training in statistics and methodology, that anybody can use to see what's going on in an empirical research article. And again, the only caveat being you have to read it. And then that could lead to questions that you could ask the PIs about these things. You yourself can then possibly use that information to judge whether it's in your best interest to continue doing that kind of research or writing up that study for publication or for press. Okay. Thank you for listening. I like that. Questions in it made it go longer. That's cool. So I'm ready to get out of here.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how research in marginalized populations might intersect with this checklist, because I think some of these populations might be hard to reach, like undocumented populations, for example, or just being in Champaign-Urbana, it's hard to recruit people sometimes.
It's impossible.
So I'm afraid that saying sample size is a hard thing that science writers need to look for is going to kind of erase the voices of these smaller groups, marginalized groups, things like that. Or to, like with Asian Americans, they're often grouped into one group, even though there's a lot of diversity within that group, just for the sake of power. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Too many ideas. I'll try to organize them. So, I mean, it should not stop people from doing research on specialized populations. So Ed Young talked about the study of the kids who was the first longitudinal study of kids before they transitioned, who were at risk for transitioning, so to speak. They were studied because they were identified early as presenting these issues to their parents and teachers. It's a beautiful study. It's only 80 kids. But there had been no study like it ever done before. And what the humorous thing is, Dr. Fraley was the grant reviewer, I was the action editor. So you don't, so this concrete evidence that though we have these ideas, you don't just automatically impose them. But we also have a different perspective on science, right? We're also very sympathetic to the idea that you want to document effects and that things can accumulate over time. So that study was hugely valuable because of the unique nature of it. It's true for many of the populations, especially indigenous populations. We should document whatever we can get and present it. What you have to consider is the dominant reinforcing paradigm in science, which is you're the grand wizard who's testing this hypothesis with this p-value. You can't do that, right? And I think that's okay. I'm having a hard time convincing my colleagues. Because we're all trained under that paradigm, right? I'm supposed to be the genius, brilliant person. This mundane documentation of reality is not what for me. I'm going to show you how much of a genius I am by testing this crazy hypothesis that I just came up with. For that type of idea, for that type of incentive system, those types of samples are really hard to work with because there is a reality, and the reality is demonstrated in Dr. Fraley's talk. You only have enough power to detect certain things given a small sample size. That's fine. And if you look at what the authors did in that study in particular, they did a beautiful job of saying, look, this is what we got. This is as far as we're going to go. We're not going to test hypotheses, but we're going to describe what's going on. It was awesome, right? So I think you have to keep those two things in mind. And the problem we have at this point is that the dominant paradigm doesn't reward that type of research, and it should. But we've got to change attitudes, which maybe some more egg salad, I suspect. But And, we have one more question, unless it's by Dan. Cool. It's 3. Okay. Let's get out of here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brent. My observation is that we need a break. 15 minutes. 3:15, we'll be back with the editors. Have a stretch, get a drink. 3:15 back here.
We're the old parts.
Executive committee. The only way I get inside.
Yeah, no, we're not all the old parts, but yeah, we're kind of the core of the people doing this sort of critical methodology work. Yeah. I'm gonna do the HDMI cable out of that. I'm plugging it into my laptop, so. Yeah.
Yeah, just can we do it towards the end of the break? I just want to.
I'll put up a slide that looks exactly like that one.
Well, this one runs.
Oh, well, I guess so.
That's all right. We'll just go ahead and do it. I just.
It was running before, so Diana will understand. I'll tell her. I take the blame. Now, my HDMI cable should have been. I wonder if my HDMI cable got. Because it was in here, and I wonder. I bet that's mine, the black one.
Okay.
Yep, that's mine. Nope, that's not mine. That's a DVI. I had a HDMI to display port, and it's gone. That's not good. I wonder if I put it back in a different part of my bag. I thought I had taken it back. I normally keep it in that bag. Is it possible if it was left here yesterday
I mean, anything that was left would be up here, so.
Hello, everybody. We're back. We're back with entomology professor May Berenbaum and psychology professor Daniel Simons. We heard from them yesterday. Today they're back as editors, and we're going to edit with the editors. I want to make a few closing announcements because after this session we're done, and I'm going to let them have the last goodbye. So this is the last time you'll hear from me. I want to thank you for participating in these 2 days of workshops, and to tell you there will be a survey coming. We'd appreciate your honest feedback. We want to gauge the interest for future efforts such as this. You know, we don't communicate unless we have an audience, so your participation is very important, and we appreciate your being here. I want to thank all of the organizers and all of the attendees, both near and far, and all of our panelists. And it's been a great couple of days with you, and I'm so eager to hear from the editors. Take it away.
Is the mic? Yeah, it is on. This is going to be a little bit more free-form than some of the other presentations, partly because we weren't completely sure on what we wanted to cover for this.
Moreover, we thought there was a call out for writing samples, and none of them arrived. So.
Yeah. So we're gonna work with what we have. So before we start, I just want to get a sense of who we have still in the room. So how many of the people here are graduate students or faculty? Okay, so about half. Yeah. How many are press information officers? Okay. And how many are science communicators of other forms? All right, so it's kind of roughly half and half. We got it already covered. Okay. So we thought we'd actually start, rather than focusing on writing initially, we'll get to that, we thought we'd spend a little bit of time maybe talking about the editing process from kind of an insider's perspective. May has done a lot more editing than I have over the years. I've done a bit over the last decade. But we're not sure how many people have really seen the process from the editor's side of things. And as gatekeepers, in a sense, what role we play and what role the review process plays.
So there's been a lot of talk about scientific papers and who can read them and who are they for. So that's one thing that unites everybody in the room is the scientific literature. So I guess we're going to look at the sausage making, how papers end up being published, and what kinds of journals there are, and what the standards are for different journals, and
maybe how articles are changing too.
And and how the whole publishing business, is in flux right now.
Yeah. So. But we should say you should interrupt all the time because we're more interested in talking about the questions you have rather than just trying to guess what's in your heads. So please interrupt. We'd much rather have this be a conversation, a discussion, than us just talking for an hour.
Unrehearsed.
Yeah.
No idea what he's going to say.
Yeah.
Kind of like Erin and Erin, right? So, well, I can start just by going over my editorial, my service in an editorial capacity. And I've been on a number of editorial boards. I've been editor-in-chief of 2, Annual Review Entomology, for 21 years. And as of January 1st, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I don't think you could find 2 more different kinds of journals, because Annual Review of Entomology is, as the name suggests, a review journal. So it publishes only one kind of paper, and that's a review, a literature review, and in only one discipline, entomology. It's 1 volume a year, about 30 papers in those volumes. Editorial staff of an editorial board of about 12 to 15. PNAS is a multidisciplinary, very high-level journal that is, in theory, publishing significant advances across the physical, biological, and social sciences. So the audience is everybody. There are 18,000 submissions a year, 3,000 papers, 25,000 pages of editorial content, an acceptance rate of about 16% overall, which is a little bit misleading because there's a different acceptance rate for members, but that's a whole different issue. Right. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Annual Review of Entomology is invited only. So you don't get a flood of papers. You get only those that you know are coming. So they're two completely different worlds. Equally fascinating. I will say that PNAS is a lot more challenging, at least in part, because there are 215 members of the editorial board plus 16 associate editors. So there are more associate editors than there are entirely the entire editorial board of Annual Review of Entomology. Whole different order of magnitude of activities.
Maybe we should explain a little bit about the difference between a contributing editor and associate editors
Oh.
of the different journals. Because does everybody know that?
Oh,
the non-graduate students might not.
Okay, so PNAS is it's a member journal, and it's goes back to first issue was 1915.
So it's Proceedings of the National Academy, so it's members of the National Academy of Sciences.
So all of the editorial board members and associate editors are all members of the National Academy of Sciences. All papers are handled by members of the National Academy of Sciences. And for a very long time, up until the last 20 years or so, members could publish actually up to 10 papers of their own per year as contributed manuscripts that just went in. And society has changed a lot, perceptions of privilege and the like. So the process is slowly evolving, and now contributed. There was a communicated track where a member could submit a paper on behalf of a colleague, which got slightly different treatment. That's gone. There's still now, so direct submissions, which are 95% of the submitted papers, and then contributed papers. Those are from members, and that's only 5% of the contributions of the submissions, but a disproportionate number of the publications. Members contribute a paper and now suggest reviewers, and the process is handled by the editorial board, but they select their own reviewers. Direct submission is like many other journals. You send it in, and there's editorial, some member of the editorial, associate editor, or some other member of the editorial board decides whether or not it should go out for review, and then that's the point at which reviewers are selected. So that's what direct submission is.
So when a member submits an article, it's guaranteed to go for review, or not?
Only if it's the contributed
Okay,
track.
so if they contribute a manuscript.
Yeah, and most members now are not doing that because of transparency issues.
Yeah.
There's a perception of privilege. It doesn't get a rigorous review, but it is very difficult. Is this going out live?
Yes.
I think I'll end it there. Okay.
Yeah. So, at most journals, the people who handle the manuscripts are people like the editors-in-chief. Well, I don't know how many you handle a year, but probably a lot. And I'm an editor-in-chief of a methods in psychology journal, so methods and research practices in psychology. It's a new journal, but from the flagship scientific society, and they only have 6 journals. So this is the newest of their journals. We handle a couple of hundred papers a year, and this is our 2nd year.
You know Mike Kazanica?
Mm-hmm, sure.
Okay, very famous psychologist, split brain experiments. He was on the editorial board. He actually handled 200 papers a year. So.
And there are journals
he was
in
a
most fields where you have
superstar.
that.
I mean, not most members don't handle that many, but some do.
So at the journals, you have the editors-in-chief who typically handle more than the associate editors. And by handle, that means you get the initial submission in. Depending on the journal's process, you might evaluate whether or not to send it for review. So
I do not look at all 18,000 papers. I just want that.
At a journal that scale, there's no way. Right?
Although some people believe I do. And they will write me a letter. And anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, our process is I'll read every submission because we're only getting a couple hundred of them. And I'll either decide immediately that this is just outside the scope of our journal. So we get a paper that has nothing whatsoever to do with methods or research practices, and I'll just reject that immediately because it's just not within scope. They didn't read the submission guidelines. They're sending their paper to any journal one after another, hoping somebody likes it, even though it actually is often sort of crazy. So those are easy. They don't take much time. For manuscripts that might be good for the journal, but we're not sure, I read it, and one of my associate editors read it. So we have 6 associate editors, which is actually really good for a journal of this new. And we will read it and evaluate and decide whether or not to send it for external review. And right now, about half of the papers we read, we think, yes, this is a good fit for the journal. Yes, it doesn't have any obvious major fundamental flaws. And those we send out for review. We'll typically try and find anywhere from 2 to 4 reviewers. We don't tend to go overboard because reviewers are hard to find, especially if you have a goal of making sure that the reviews are representative of the field and that they have the necessary expertise. I have the advantage that my area is very constrained, right? It's psychology methods and research practices, but the people who are submitting that come from every area of psychology, and some of the specific examples they use come from every area of psychology. So we have to somehow address both the theoretical claims, the methodological claims, and the practice claims. And
it's a little more difficult at PNAS
much more,
because it's every biological, physical, and social science. What's more, PNAS is where a lot of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary studies go. And it's very important under those circumstances to get reviewers that have expertise, not necessarily in the independent disciplines, but at the interface of those disciplines. I'm a chemical ecologist by training. Now there is a distinct field called chemical ecology, but throughout much of my career, a chemist and an ecologist reading a chemical ecology paper really would fail to come to the same conclusion about it, because the interfaces, the edges of disciplines are different from the central part of disciplines. Different challenge.
So I mean, our challenge is a little easier in that sense. We don't have quite as much cross-discipline work, but it's very much a challenge. If you've, how many of the scientists in the room have done a peer review? Okay, great. It's as more junior faculty and graduate students, I actually think it's great to get reviews from senior graduate students because they're often much more invested. They're much more up on the most recent method developments in my subfield, and they're great reviewers.
Yeah. Absolutely no doubt. They are the most critical reviewers. In part because life teaches you disappointments and lowers your expectations. So seriously, I mean, by the time you've been doing this for years, your expectations are very low. So.
So one of the things I found interesting really recently, and I think this is more true maybe in some of the harder sciences like physics, we're starting to encounter papers with 150 to 200 authors. And this is a new trend in psychology. That didn't used to be the case. But if you're thinking about a paper like this, let's say you have this registered replication report on ego depletion, for example, that Brent was talking about a little while ago. Just comes to mind. That one had about 30 teams of researchers, each with 3 or 4 co-authors on it. So we're dealing with 100 plus authors. They are, for the most part, all of the top researchers in that field. Try and find a reviewer who's not already an author, wasn't advised by or an advisor of one of the authors, and who's also an expert on the topic.
Who hasn't jointly published something.
Exactly, hasn't jointly published anything with any of those authors, isn't in the same department as any of those authors, because all of those are conflicts of interest.
Yeah, and the comparable field in biology is genome work, where you can get 100 authors or more. There is allegedly a Large Hadron Collider paper with 1,000 authors.
Yeah. It's almost as many authors as words, I think, in the paper.
I wrote that one.
Yeah. I wrote the right here. Yes?
Actually, some of these super large collaborations, they just put the names of the
Question. Can you hold your question so we can get it mic'd?
I'll repeat it out loud this time. So,
but we're not there yet. We're trying to find reviewers.
So
that's the problem.
So the question was, just so that people watching, for a super large collaboration, does the paper list every single author on it as an author? That's a standard that's changing too, right? So one of the things that's switching relatively recently, there's standards for what counts as authorship. And in many of these cases, the work that people contribute might be critical, but it might not merit authorship on a paper because they haven't actually written anything. So one of the things that's happening now is you'll have a consortium, right? And you'll still be able to find them in Google Scholar or in the indexing services. They'll still count as something for their Vita as a publication, but not all of the authors will be listed on the title page of the paper. Right? And it's a way to deal with this problem of 5 pages of authors followed by a page of manuscript.
And now, as apropos of authorship, I don't know if it's most journals, but many journals now require authors to identify their role in the research.
Yeah.
So PNAS does this so that it's clear there are no, for want of a better term, parasites or hangers-on.
Vanity authors.
Or vanity authors.
Yeah.
That, so everyone's specific contribution is listed in the manuscript.
If you're a scientist, you should be doing this on any collaborative paper you write, both because it means you get credit for the work that you've done, and you don't get the blame. If it turns out that you've been tacked onto a paper, you didn't do any of the work, so let's say you didn't do any of the data analysis, and it turns out the person who did the data analysis was a fraud. Right? We've had cases of this in the sciences where somebody was making up their data, they were collaborating with lots of people who didn't realize that they were making up their data. So they were actually exonerated because they had no idea. They weren't involved in that process of it. They generated the first idea, or they had a model that this fraudulent researcher was applying in their own work, and they were brought in as a co-author because of the modeling part. I've been on papers, not fraudulent ones, I hope, but I've been on papers that deal with neuroimaging. I don't do neuroimaging. I don't know anything about neuroimaging. I should get no credit for any of the neuroimaging work in those papers. I'm brought in as a methodology expert or on the behavioral end of things. I don't know the neuroimaging end of things. I don't want the credit or the blame for that work.
It's actually helpful if you have a question about research. You'll know which author to approach with the question.
Right. Yeah, if you're a press officer or you're a journalist, looking at the author notes, if they do this correctly, you should be able to see which author you should go to. Yeah, there's a question. Microphone's on its way.
So do you see that kind of identification becoming more of a standard in publications?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We require it.
It's really astonishing how much the publishing world has changed. You know, when PNAS started in 1915, there was no peer review. There was no peer review across science, really, until after World War II. Yeah. Now, you know, it's the gold standard. But a lot of Nobel Prize-winning work was published without peer review prior to the
There's a story, I don't know if it's true, that Einstein was flabbergasted that he had to have a paper undergo peer review. Like, this is ridiculous.
He has no peers.
Yeah. So it's a relatively new concept in sciences.
It really is, and even though it is so ingrained now, it's as in so many of these. Authorship is another thing. Charles Valentine Riley was actually director of the Bureau of Entomology late 19th century, and he purportedly wrote 400 plus papers, but the practice at the time was anything that was done under his supervision as the director of the Bureau of Entomology came out under his name. And that would never fly today. So it's
still
really
the case
hard going back through the literature to figure out who did the science.
It's still the case that in some subfields where if it's done in your lab, you're an author on the paper even if you had nothing whatsoever to do with it other than supplying the lab, which is...
Opening up the door in the morning.
Yeah, if that, right? So that is an issue, but I think adding author notes is a critical disclosure element. There are a lot of things that I think are improving a lot in terms of transparency and disclosure.
Current conflicts of interest.
Yep.
Again, you never used to see those, and that's really important. It's a big issue at PNAS, even the perception of conflict of interest, because there are technical conflicts and there are squishy conflicts. So, for example, NSF, which anybody who's applied for an NSF grant, you have to list every conflict of interest. Usually if you've authored a paper with someone in the past 2 or 5 or whatever the time period is, years, I always put down my major professor as a conflict of interest, even though it is not a technical conflict, because my thesis was submitted in 1980, and that is way beyond, but I will always have a bias. So anyone whom I want to see succeed, I have a conflict with.
And that's a big challenge now with some of these multi-authored papers. I've been a collaborator, co-author on papers with other people who I have never met and never had a conversation with, because the part I contributed was independent of what they were contributing, and it was a large consortium paper. Technically, I have to list that person as a conflict of interest for a grant application, even though there really isn't one, because not only do I not know them, I've never worked with them. Right? But there are other cases that are really challenging ambiguities.
I think we have a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, we don't have a question.
In biomed and even agrochemical arenas, the perception of conflict of interest is an issue. Because even if you're working at a biopharma, like a pharmaceutical company, on a basic biology question, and there is a patent involved, even though that might be in a different department and you may be working on a very basic component that is only peripherally related and you're not on the patent or you're not even likely to be listed on the patent, there's a perception. Many of these perceptions are misperceptions. I have been accused of being in the pocket of industry. I published a paper on the lack of non-target toxicity of a genetically modified corn plant to a particular type of caterpillar. That's what the data said, and I was accused of being in the pocket of Monsanto because Monsanto funds research at University of Illinois. Not my research. I don't know anyone who even has Monsanto money. And also because I served on a committee for the Entomological Society of America that had an award sponsored by Monsanto. Okay, I didn't get the award. I didn't even know the award was sponsored by Monsanto. I never met any other members of these committees in person. It was all done by phone. That's not even an imaginary conflict, but there is a perception. And people who have a mindset of default assumption of evil intent on the part of any sort of industry will search very high and low for any tenuous connection. That pocket, totally empty. The paper in question was funded with internal funds. I knew better than to use funds from even the USDA because it was a controversial area. But people will still look for that connection.
A lot of journals are getting a little bit better about this. And are becoming aware of how much privilege plays a role in the publication process. So PNS has been moving toward eliminating, or at least reducing, the privilege of being a member.
Which annoys many members.
It does, yeah. And APS, the Psychological Society.
As it's been put to me, you become, if you're elected to the Russian National Academy of Science, you get a dacha and a Daimler, a car and a house to live in a nice location. PNAS, you get your crummy contributed papers and that's it. So,
yeah. But yeah, APS, this Association for Psychological Science, just a year or so ago changed a policy that had been long-standing, which was that if you were an associate editor at Psychological Science, for example, the flagship journal, your papers would automatically go out for peer review. They wouldn't ever get desk rejected. And they'd be handled by the editor-in-chief. We changed that because as an editor-in-chief, I can't handle a paper that's submitted by one of my associate editors who I trust and rely on to make judgments about whether other papers should or should not be accepted. So we've implemented a policy where we always have a guest editor now. Anytime an associate editor or is an author on a paper, I never handle it. Right? So if I get a submission from one of my associate editors, and that's relatively rare because I discourage it, it automatically gets punted to another editor at another journal, and they decide whether it's desk rejected or whether it gets sent for review. I know nothing about it until the decision's made, which means I'm handing over complete executive editor control, but it's not a bad thing in that context.
This is very new.
Yeah, very new, 1 year.
Okay.
So we had a question here and then a question up back.
Yeah, so going back to your discussion about it's easy for outside people to tie or see potential conflicts of interest. Given that, what advice do you have for scientists when you fill out that line of declaring conflict of interest? What do you want us to put there?
Well, I guess the obligation, even for grant submissions, is the technical conflicts. There's a problem with perceptions. I mean, some of them are legitimate concerns, and some of them are really not legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
I think that.
So let's say you have 4 different research projects in your lab, and one is funded by Monsanto, and you're publishing another study that had nothing to do with the Monsanto grant. Should you still declare that my lab received some funding from Monsanto or something like that?
If the I wouldn't think that would be necessary if the Monsanto money is funding a completely different project.
If they're related projects, I would say you absolutely should disclose it. I mean, the way I tend to think of conflicts is if somebody could look at it and say, I think this might be a conflict, even if it actually hasn't changed your behavior at all, just disclose it. I mean, err on the side of transparency rather than, you're never going to get hammered for saying, yeah, you might perceive this as a conflict. I don't think it was, but here's why you might.
But I will insist that just because the University of Illinois has faculty members that get money from Monsanto, I don't have a conflict.
That's not your conflict.
That's not my conflict. It's not my pocket.
Right.
But yeah, if it is your lab and it's a related project, I would agree.
I think there was a question way up back first, and then we'll come back.
Sorry, I'm going to do the hypothetical. Some have argued.
Can you raise your hand? Okay.
That the existing publication structure is one of the primary sources of the production of iffy science.
Production of what?
Iffy science.
Iffy science. So you represent the problem. What are you doing at your journals to concretely address and minimize the unreliable science that's produced and to, let's say, mend the status structure in a way that contributes to better science?
Do you want to start with that, or should I?
Well,
you've got a longer running journal than I have, so.
Well, reviews are different. You know, as an editor of Annual Review of Entomology, it's really, unless it's a systematic review or a meta-analysis, in which case there are methods involved, but if it's just sort of a literature review. It's easier to address like fraud. I mean, now I know PNAS has in place all kinds of software designed to detect all kinds of fraud. Image manipulation is a huge challenge. Plagiarism is a continuing challenge, but we have new tools. It's like I was talking about yesterday, there's an arms race. So there are people who are trying to cheat the system, and then there's new technology designed to address that. There are statistical editors available when statistical issues arise. So that's also helpful. There's many people think we should get rid of peer review. We should have, everything should be open access and archived, and we should we should crowdsource reviews. And there's really a lot of ferment right now in the publishing business. But I will say, in my view, it's better than it has ever been. And I know it's not perfect, but it is improving. Transparency is improving. Reliability is improving. The one thing I won't say is writing is improving. It's not.
No.
I'm sorry. There are journals I don't even think that have copy editors. So, God, when you've got a grammatical error, a glaring grammatical error in the title of a paper, how do you live with that? You know?
So I was going to say a couple of things are happening in the field that I think are changing it without completely abandoning the journal structure. A lot of the people who kind of advocate for abandoning journals and putting everything in public archives and then treating everything as a preprint and having post-preprint review, I think in principle, that would be wonderful if it worked, but I guarantee what would end up happening is reinforcing status and privilege. So if you get an old fart writing a paper, if I already have visibility, people will read it. If I'm a graduate student who hasn't published yet and I put my preprint out there and I don't know a lot of people and I'm an introvert, so I'm not constantly out on social networks hyping my own work and getting other people to do it, nobody's going to read it. Right? I mean, occasionally it'll break through, but it would involve so much more luck to break through as a junior early career researcher than it would as a senior researcher that I'm not sure that making everything out there is necessarily going to be a panacea.
And two other things that concern me. I know that it's been reported about 30% of the reviews on Amazon are phony. So, so much for the reliability of sort of the crowd. And what was the second one? Anyway, well, I know. Here in Champaign-Urbana, there's News Gazette conducts a poll of the 10 best restaurants, 10 best vegetarian restaurants, 10 best Italian restaurants. Taco Bell has appeared consistently in the top 10 list of Mexican restaurants. I'm not sure I want those people doing the reviews of scientific papers.
And scientific review doesn't always work, but one thing that I think is changing and that is, I think, potentially a panacea for a lot of these sorts of problems, and it applies for one kind of research in particular, that sort of confirmatory hypothesis testing research, is what's known as a registered report. And this is a relatively new approach. The idea has been around but not fleshed out. So the idea of a registered report is the peer review process occurs prior to data collection. So if you're a graduate student, this is essentially what your prelim should be, right? Where you propose a thesis, you lay out the methods, you lay out what you're going to do, and your committee agrees, yes, you should do this, and no matter how it comes out, it will be informative, right? So it's kind of like a contract for your dissertation. You can do journal articles the same way. So we do this as an article type in which people submit the introduction, the methods section, laying it out in detail. They submit a results section that gives an example of how they're going to analyze the data, gives simulated data to simulate what the figures will look like. They can give contingent language. So if the effect comes out this way, here's what we'll say. If it comes out this way, here's what we'll say. So essentially, you know what form the paper will take, but the peer review occurs prior to data collection so that you can evaluate whether it's a good study. And the content isn't what's driving it. So the nice thing about that is that it leads to a much more unbiased review. If you're doing a replication and you send it to the original authors of the study to evaluate, they can't just quibble because it didn't come out the way they wanted. They have to evaluate whether the study was good and raise objections before the study, which is much harder to do if you don't want to accept the results. So that approach, I think, is going to be really successful. It's adopted now by a couple of hundred journals, and I'm hoping it will be adopted as a more mainstream. It won't work for everything. It doesn't work for large-scale exploratory studies. It doesn't work particularly well for existing data sets where you already kind of know something about that data set. But it's kind of the ultimate in transparency of what's going to happen. And you can't you can't have that hypothesizing after results are known because you don't know them yet. So it forces you to write in a fair way. Once that's provisionally accepted, you get to run the study, and then you can't change the introduction and the methods and the results and analysis, other than to note, hey, we thought we were going to do it this way, but we didn't. We found problems there, so we're going to do this exploratory analysis that wasn't what we planned. You have to flag that really clearly and transparently as something different. Yeah.
So my question has to do with when journals post papers online, manuscripts online, and there's real variance among all the journals that are out there. PNAS, I know, for example, at least as far as I know, will send out a note to PIOs and to the scientists themselves, the researchers, saying we're gonna publish your paper on X date or during the week if it's online. And so everyone has advance notice. Also, PNAS, as far as I know, doesn't put a paper up when it hasn't been peer reviewed. And other journals do that, but some other journals put up preprints, which my interpretation as a PIO is that it's been conditionally accepted by the journal, but hasn't undergone formal peer review. Then you have open source journals like PLOS ONE that just puts them up. They haven't even really been looked at.
We should back up a little bit because there are a couple of different ways that happens.
So can you walk us through why are journals in their rush to accept or put up manuscripts online? It creates a confusing landscape, not only for PIOs, but also for the researchers and also for the journalists. So if we're trying to let journalists know, we don't even know when is the appropriate time to do it. When has this paper actually been vetted enough that we can actually pitch it with some confidence, for example, among other reasons.
I was going to say yesterday, if you were here, I put up a list of, ad hoc list of tips for writing, and my number 3, I think, was if it hasn't yet been peer reviewed, don't write about it yet. And I got.
Young did a story about a preprint last year, and he's done. He said he does them all the time.
Well, I got blowback about that from journalists. One concern that I have is reflected by that, among other things, all those cell phone studies were not peer-reviewed. But the thing that, okay, so in entomology or in biology in general, if you describe a species, you're describing a species, there's something called a type specimen. This is an ancient concept, goes back a couple of hundred years. The species description is anchored to a particular individual specimen. It's maintained in a museum, and everyone in the world can, request access to that specimen. So it's there, unchanging, forever. That's what it is. That's the species exemplar. The thing about peer review and publication, in my view, that's it. It's not going to change. We all know what we're talking about when it's published as a peer-reviewed article, and it doesn't change. Now, archiving and open sourcing reviews is a very fluid process. So there are multiple versions at any time in the history of a paper. So it's getting better. They're working out the methods, but as it stands now, one reason behind the philosophy of PNAS is that everyone will be talking about the same thing. If it's that the availability is determined by post-peer review publication or post.
I think there's an important distinction here that what your question kind of glosses over a little bit. When a journal posts an article, it already has gone through peer review. They almost never will post an article prior to peer review. The researchers might, and that's called posting a preprint. So when a journal posts it, they might post it in different stages, right? So they might post it after peer review, after it's been accepted, but before it's been copy edited in manuscript form. All that should change at that point is copy editing. So if you have an exact quote, a word might change, but the substance shouldn't. Then the next stage is actually counted as publication, which is online first publication. That's already been typeset, copy edited, it just doesn't have page numbers. That's actually considered the published version. It has the same document identifier, right?
Yeah,
and
that's the type
the
specimen,
DOI
as it
is
were.
the same thing. And then that, when it becomes the printed paper, that's the same paper. That won't change. So if the journal posts it, they're basically saying, we've vetted this, we've accepted this, this is the version we accepted. Any changes that happen at this point are going to be trivial, copy editing level changes. Researchers can publish preprints on archive or other sorts of preprint archives. This is something that's really in flux in how the field handles this. So one of the things that we've had to deal with at our journal, is a new journal that's found in the middle of this kind of revolution in how much of the field handles. Some fields have always done this. Physics has posted preprints. The final article kind of doesn't matter in physics because it's self-censoring, right? You wouldn't post something to archive if you didn't think it had been fully vetted and it was right, because nobody would read your work after that. But it's a small field, right? So eventually it ends up in an archival version in the journal, but the preprint is probably good enough once it's been publicly vetted there. Fields as big as psychology, that doesn't fly because anybody can post anything, and there's not quite the credibility hit if you post garbage. But so one of the things that Ed Young was talking about yesterday was writing an article based on a preprint. And there's a really interesting sense in which, as a journalist, if you really vet a piece of work, if you contact 8 experts, get their take on this article, if they actually read it and give you feedback, in a sense, you're doing a more thorough job than peer review does.
That's what one of the tweets said.
And it's a real problem, right? For us as editors, we can't ask 8 people to read every single paper, and we wouldn't want to.
Well, we actually ask 8 people and 7 refuse.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. That's the more common. That's the hidden secret that often you'll have to ask 10, 12, 15 people to get 2 or 3. And one of the big lags in the review process is you ask 3 or 4 people, because you don't want to ask 10 right away. You ask 3 or 4, and then you have to wait a week for them to respond. And then they say no, and then you have to ask another, and then you have to wait another week. If you get a peer review request and you can't get to it, please just reply right away and say, sorry, I can't do it right now. That's much, much better than doing the passive-aggressive thing of waiting until it times out. That's a disaster for the editing process. But yeah, so preprints get posted. I have a media call from a journalist to talk about one tomorrow that is not a published paper yet. But it's been heavily, heavily discussed by many, many experts on social media.
And
So,
PNAS, for example,
yeah.
will accept archive papers
Yeah.
as submitted papers. I mean, it's not Engelfinger's rule. You can't, this is
that's a big change in how
new
the field's handled
concept.
it.
Yeah, so you don't ruin your chances at a journal like PNAS if you post it on an archive.
There are journals that still don't like you to do that, but we actually ask people to post them beforehand, get the peer feedback, fix the
Then
article,
submit.
and then submit it, rather than posting it at the same time that we're sending it out for peer review, and then you get comments on social media saying, well, you didn't do this, and say, oh, we'll fix that in the revision. It's like, well, what are we reviewing then? Right, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's the problem of anchoring it in time, and people have not yet, this is so new, people haven't figured it out yet. So.
Are we ending at
4:15.
Okay. I raised my hand back when we were talking about conflicts of interest. So I hope I don't create a time loop.
Oh, got it.
But it was actually, I see in social media commentary a lot on when we actually succeed in getting news out to the public, and they see even the primary article, or they see a comment and see, oh, there is a conflict of interest. This was funded by the Almond Board. This was funded by Monsanto or Bayer, whoever now. How do you convey a responsible level of nuance about conflict of interest, as you indicated, can mean a lot of things. How
Actually,
can you do a good job of explaining what it could mean for that particular piece of research?
Funding source is not a conflict of interest. And a conflict of interest does not prevent publication. It just has to be declared.
Right.
So the problem is when people don't declare. That's like you were saying, you're always better off saying, you know.
That's a problem for publishing, but the question is for interpreting. Right?
I guess if I can clarify, if someone reads that, they might be inclined to read that and say, oh, I'm going to ignore everything that I just read.
There are conspiracy theorists who will always assume, however, that somehow the work is contaminated in some way.
Sometimes it is. Right? Sometimes there are biases. Right? I mean,
but then also, there can also be so many other sources of bias. Just, I don't know, this probably a waste of everybody's time, but a very formative moment in my life was listening to my father and my Uncle Jimmy argue at a dinner one night. My father was a chemist, an industrial chemist, worked for Allied Chemical. And Uncle Jimmy was an accountant. There was a study that had come out about effects of whether dietary and serum cholesterol were related. And it was one of these epidemiological studies with thousands of subjects, and there was no significant correlation between dietary and serum cholesterol. My Uncle Jimmy pointed out it was funded by the Egg Board. Of course there was no correlation. My father said, you think that a funding source is going to corrupt a scientist, and a scientist would deliberately, so there was a huge argument. They'd both had heart attacks before. So I said, okay, let me explain something. And I went on at great length about how you can even have a significant correlation that explains virtually no variance. So you can especially with large numbers, you can get a 0.001 correlation that P level that has a correlation coefficient of 0.02, which explains only less than 2/100ths of a percent of the variation. So, and I went on and on about this. Eventually, everybody got bored and went back to dinner. So, so the point is, it doesn't matter if it's declared. People will interpret it in the most sinister way. Just make an effort to be fair and balanced, for want of a better.
I do think there are cases in which you probably should be a little more skeptical of a paper that has a vested interest, right? So in the literatures that I work on, so brain training is a literature that I spend a lot of time reviewing, and it is really hard to find anybody who writes an article showing positive evidence for brain training who also isn't tied to a company that produces brain training products. So they're not going to be able to continue doing the work if they don't produce positive results in that area. That's true for a lot of fields, but would I be more trusting of a finding from an independent lab that doesn't have those sorts of ties? Yeah. Would I be more trusting of a positive finding from a lab that was skeptical of those claims? Absolutely, right? So you always have to kind of evaluate who's doing it, why are they doing it? We're people, right? And I would be a little more cautious.
I'm a little biased by my background in ecology, where nobody really cares what the
Yeah.
you know. But in reality, they do, because they have a sort of a theoretical vested interest. But that's very different from financial.
Yeah.
So that's excellent advice. Yes. Thank you for waiting.
So, to allude one of the things that May mentioned, once upon a time, Latin was the lingua franca of natural or physical sciences, and then it became German, and then switched to English. And when that happened, pretty much the top journals were produced either in the US or in the UK. But nowadays, almost everywhere in the world, there is a source of a journal published in English. So I think that brings a lot of potential risks for the copy editing issue that you brought before, especially if you compare, I mean, even two countries that speak the same language, like US and England, a lot of terms have similar, different spelling. Aluminum and aluminium, realization with S and Z, and so on. So, and also I noticed from talking to people from other countries who speak the same language as my first language, sometimes the same word has a radically different meaning in another country that speaks the same language.
I was on the editorial board of Journal Chemical Ecology, and that journal was getting so many submissions from Asia that they actually hired an editor for non-native English language submissions. Annual Review of Entomology invited an editor from China to serve on the editorial board. So you're absolutely right. Lingua franca is a challenge for anyone who doesn't happen to speak it. So, but I mean, some of these errors, and I don't want to single out particular journals, but it's just plain English grammar from native speakers who should know better.
I don't think most journals are terribly worried about whether you use the British or English spellings of things.
But subjects and verbs should always
standardized,
agree.
yes.
You know,
Yeah.
It's funny. We were before this session comparing some of our pet language peeves, and many of them are the same, and they're just errors. Oh, by the way, it's does not have an apostrophe unless you mean it is. So please don't misspell a three-letter word.
Hi. So just to get back to the iffy science thing a little bit, I think one of the solutions is to incentivize or allow for more publication of null and exploratory results, right? Does that happen at the editor level, or does it have to happen somewhere else in the process?
Journal level.
Yeah.
Registered reports are ideal for that, right? Because if it was a well-designed study, it should be informative, even if it's not statistically significant. I personally am not a big fan of statistical significance testing. The last several papers I published have had no p-values in them. But it's hard to pull that off, and I'm coming from a position of privilege, which makes it a lot easier. But yeah, I think a lot of journals are moving that direction. Registered reports have that huge advantage that if it's a good study, it's a good study. It should be published.
There's another level at PNAS. If anyone's ever reviewed for PNAS, one of the questions, review criteria, is this in the top 10% of all publications in this area? Another review criterion is whether it's of general interest. So what PNAS is supposed to do is sort of skim off the most interesting. And that's a difficult, very subjective assessment. So
it's hard for null results, right? A lot of people will say null results are uninteresting.
Hard to. I mean, there's some cases where you fail to find a relationship can be of
if you're dealing
general
with genetics, right? That's
interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it doesn't apply equally, and it's a little bit harder. But it's supposed to be a little bit harder. And the same thing for nature and science, who have higher impact factors and often, juggle to maintain those, will use that same criterion that it is it of broad interest. And there's really, it's very subjective.
I would like for our field to be able to determine that based on the quality of the study and not based on the significance of the results. That's probably going to take structural change to how the field publishes
Across
in order
science,
for that to
yeah.
happen. Yeah. Harmony?
A second ago, you mentioned pet peeves in language, minor pet peeves. I was wondering more generally or more broadly what your pet peeves as editors are and things that we can do as authors to avoid irritating editors.
Well, one that we agreed on, what I really hate is the use of, this study will increase our understanding. The use of the plural, the royal we, our. Do you mean your co-authors? Do you mean all of humanity? It is scientifically imprecise. Don't use it, because in the same manuscript, some authors will say our to mean the authors and our to mean all of humanity. That's one I don't like.
Broader themes, I think, are true not just for science writing, but for all communication. Show, don't tell. All of the press officers here, I'm sure, know that concept, right? Not many grad students necessarily apply that, but if you, for example, if you use the word interestingly, right, that's immediately saying, I couldn't convince you that this was interesting, so I'm having to tell you that it is. Or not very compelling.
Even surprisingly.
Yeah. If it was surprising to you, okay, but why not explain why it was surprising or show why it was surprising?
So value-laden words do not belong.
Yep. Obvious, if you say obviously, that means it was obvious to you and nobody else. Clearly means it's not clear, right?
Yeah.
But generally, the worst thing I see in academic writing, and I see this all the time in methods papers, is just really turgid, science-y prose. Right? Trying to write to make it sound like it's scientific, everything in passive voice. Yeah. Referring to yourself as the author.
Oh. It has been found that entire phrase is totally unnecessary.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, anything of the form X has Y that, and in the sentence, cut everything, including the word that, and you're fine, right? Research has shown that. People have found that. It has long been known that. Just get rid of it, right? But kind of overly wordy attempts to sound more intellectual and serious.
I don't even know if that's the intent. It's that
it just comes across that way. You learn that writing everything in passive voice.
Yeah.
There's no need. Avoiding use of first person at all costs. Don't do that, right? You're a scientist. You're writing it.
And passive voice is not scientific. You know, the solution was poured, or the length was measured. By whom? You know, that's not precise. Did someone break into the lab and do it? You know,
there's a great trick if you're not sure. Yeah, if you're not sure what's passive voice and what's not, there's a great trick for it. See if you can add the word "by zombies" to the sentence.
That's a good
one. The liquid was poured by zombies, right? If you can do that, it's passive voice, and you probably don't want it. Yeah.
With mice.
There's only one or two exceptions for why you would want to use passive voice consistently. One would be just to change things up a little bit and not make it all monotonous in the same structure.
That's another writing peeve.
Yeah.
You know, subject verb, subject verb, subject verb, subject verb.
Yeah.
Boring to read.
So that's one reason to use passive voice occasionally. The other is if you want to blame somebody without naming them, right? So the reason, that's why so many apologies are of the form, mistakes were made, right? Because you don't want to say that I made mistakes. Right? If you want to kind of say somebody's done something really dumb, but you don't want to name them, right? That's a nice way to do it. But that's really the only reason if you want to hide something. That's what passive voice is good
passive
for.
Passive voice is good at obfuscation.
Yeah. So.
Getting back to the fact that you can send out requests for review and get maybe 2, that's a sample size that I'm not super comfortable with. So my question is, how do we incentivize peer review in a non-perverse way, or is that even possible?
You mean get more people to do it?
Dealing with an N of 2 for a decision.
Yeah, like how could you reward people for the time that it takes to...
Well, on promotion and tenure documents, you list what journals you review for. So that's in your own best interest to review. it gives your executive officer an opportunity to say, an indication of the esteem in which this individual is held is the fact that his or her opinion is sought by the premier journals in the field. So if you are, if you're pre-tenure, it's in your own best interest to accept invitations to peer review, particularly for prestigious or field leading journals.
So one advantage of it is it's particularly helpful for early career researchers, and they are the best reviewers consistently. Partly because it gets you known, right? So even if you don't sign your reviews, and people vary a lot on whether they feel they should sign their reviews. I always have signed my reviews since grad school. Other people I know have never signed their reviews, and I think either approach is fine. But it's still the case that the editor who handles your manuscript knows you did the review. If you do a good job on it, that person might well be your tenure writer. Because they're an expert in your field. They're one of the leaders in your field. They're the kinds of people who get asked to write tenure letters. So doing reviews, if you get the opportunity as an early career researcher, can have down the line benefits. But I think the bigger issue you raised is how are we making decisions based on N of 2? And it does lead to bad decisions at times. I think one thing that people don't realize is that reviewers' jobs are not to accept or reject papers. Right? They're to give guidance. And some editors don't get that, and they'll get 8 reviewers, and they'll tally up how many were yay and nay and make a decision that way, and those are bad editors. You don't want that.
Absolutely.
You want an editor who is using their own judgment and evaluating whether that paper is solid, rigorous, informative, and they seek out reviews who will provide the information that they can't assess themselves. So if I'm reviewing a technically complex paper, I might be able to handle one part of that paper and know all about it. I might not know anything about the particular statistical technique they're applying. I need to get reviewers on that, right? Because I need their guidance. So that's the real goal of review. Editors are making judgments, and that's their job.
Actually, at PNAS, there's multiple levels of judgment because there are associate editors, there are editorial board members, and then there are the member editors. And so it's not always just the sort of the bottom level of review. There's also, most journals have an appeals process. So if you've really, particularly for irresponsible editors who weigh 2 reviews equally, even when it's clear somebody hasn't read the manuscript or has a personal axe to grind, part of being an editor is to use judgment.
And mistakes do get into the literature.
Mistakes get all the time.
Yeah, it's inevitable that occasionally you're going to accept a paper that has an error in it. More often than not, those are innocent errors. Right? Somebody just kind of screwed something up. They copy-pasted a table. They're not as, a lot of the sort of corrections, I think corrections should become much more commonplace and not have stigma attached to it, because everybody makes mistakes. Right? Everybody who's written papers makes mistakes at times.
It's not even technical mistakes. There's that squishy evaluation of, this belongs in a more specialized journal. This is not important enough. This is not, so that's not a mistake you can correct.
Right. And we have to make that judgment, right? So I'll get a paper that's a terrific method advance, but it's only a method advance within a subfield. We don't publish those. So I'll say, this is a great idea. I love this. I want to see this published. We can't publish it. It belongs here. And that's a big part of editing.
One little anecdote here. I explained impact factor, the sort of average number of times. So I had a manuscript rejected by a journal with an impact factor of, I think, 0.6, which was I think it was maybe just barely over 1, which was a little embarrassing. I sent it to a journal with an even lower impact factor. It did get accepted. It is now one of my most widely cited papers. So that's a mistake. It was not a technical error. It was an error in judgment. In this paper, in retrospect, was ahead of its time, and people closest to the field didn't. In fact, the most damning sentence I ever got was from that 1.0 impact factor journal, which was, I think the phrase was, quite without redeeming value. Seriously, I got that in a review, and that has gone on to be one of my more widely cited papers.
I'm personally not a fan of impact factor at all. I think it's kind of a useless metric.
It is.
But
worse
that's-
than useless
yeah.
because it's harmful.
Yeah, it is often damaging.
Particularly to early career.
And it's a huge problem in some parts of the world, especially. It's not as much in the States, but there are many
Asia.
universities. Yeah, Asia in particular emphasizes publication in high impact factor journals.
You get raises,
It's incentives
you
based.
get
Yeah.
privileges, you
it's a big
get
problem.
promotions based on just a handful of journals.
I'm so glad that we've concluded this 2-day workshop bashing impact factor metrics. Thank you both so much for all that you've given to the workshop. We're done.
Okay.
Go home. Take some food, please.